Hey, welcome, Esoteric Doooovidism here. Back on the homeward stretch. Um, a lot of work, like I probably put 100 hours into this consciousness. I got a little more stuff I want to cover. Some stuff on linguistics and some stuff on one more article I plan to read on overview of the scientific evidence of consciousness arising from the brain. And then I have some PowerPoints. So today I'm going to do some basic philosophy. And tomorrow, hopefully, I'll finish up with the science. Make sure it's working. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, Maimonides' Parable of the Palace from the Guide to the Perplexed. The ruler is in his palace, and all of his subjects are partly within the city and partly outside the city. Of those who are within the city, some have turned their backs upon the ruler's habitation, their faces being turned another way. Others seek to reach the ruler's habitation, torn towards it, and desire to enter it and stand before him. But up till now, they've not seen the wall of habitation. Some of those who seek to reach it have come up to the habitation and walk around it searching for its gate. Some of them have entered the gate and walk around the antechambers. Some of them entered the inner corridor of habituation, have come up to be with the king in one and the same place with him, namely in the ruler's habituation. But their having come into the inner part of the habituation does not mean that they see the ruler or speak to him, for after they're coming into the inner part of the habituation, it is indispensable that they should make another effort. Then they will be in the presence of the ruler, see him from afar or from nearby, or hear the ruler's speech or speak to him. So know, my son, that as long as you are engaged in studying the mathematical sciences and the art of logic, you are one of those who walk around the house searching for its gate. However, if you have understood the natural things, you have entered the habituation and are walking in the antechambers. If, however, you have achieved the perfection in the natural things and you have understood divine science, you have entered the ruler's palace into the inner chamber and are with him in one habituation. This is the mark of men of science. There are those who set up their thought to work after having attained perfection in the divine science, turn wholly towards God, renounce what is other than he, and direct all the acts of their intellect toward an examination of the beings with a view to drawing from them proof with regard to him, so as to know his governance of them in whatever way is possible. These people are those who are present in the ruler's council. This is the rank of the prophets. Among them there is he who, because of the greatness of his apprehension and his renouncing everything that is other than God, has attained such a degree that it is said of him, and he was there with the Lord, putting questions and receiving answers, speaking and being spoken to in that holy place. And because of his great joy in that which apprehended, he did not eat bread nor drink water, for his intellect attained such strength that all the gross faculties of the body ceased to function. I refer to the various kinds of senses of touch. Some prophets could only see, some of them far from close, some of them from afar. As Jeremiah says, from afar the Lord appeared unto me. The various degrees of prophecy have already been discussed by us. Let us now return to the subject of this chapter, which is to confirm men in the intention to set their thought to the work of God alone after they have achieved knowledge of them. As we have explained, this is the worship peculiar to those who have apprehended the true realities. The more they think of him and being with him, the more their worship increases. When man has achieved purity of thought, clear perception of God by the proper method, and beatitude through which he perceives, it will never be possible for evil of any kind to befall this man, because he is with God and God is with him. However, when he averts himself from God, in which state he is hidden from God and God is hidden from him, he is a target for every evil thing that happens to come his way. This thing, which includes providence and saves man from the raging sea of change and chance happenings, is just that intellectual emanation. As to your question about the nations, So this is from a different letter of Maimonides. As to your letter about the nations, know that the Lord desires the heart, and that the intention of the heart is the measure of all things. That is what our sages say the pious men among the gentiles have a share in the world to come, namely, if they have acquired what can be acquired of the knowledge of God, and if they have ennobled their souls with worthy qualities. There is no doubt that every man who ennobles his soul with excellent morals and wisdom based on the faith of God certainly belongs to the men of the world to come. This is why our sages said, even a non-Jew who studies the Torah of our master Moses resembles a high priest. What is essential is nothing else than one tries to elevate his soul towards God through Torah. And the philosophers declared that it is very difficult to find a man who is completely perfect in morality and wisdom. He in whom this perfection is found is called a saint, and surely such a man is on the steps which lead to a higher world. Besides, there is no doubt that the patriarchs, as well as Noah and Adam, who obviously did not observe the Torah, by no means became denizens of hell. On the contrary, as they achieve what pertains to the ennoblement of man, they are raised aloft, and this cannot be secured by fasting, praying, and lamentation if knowledge and true faith are absent, because in such behavior God can be near to the mouth but far from the heart. The basis of all things is knowledge that nothing is eternal except God alone. Another letter from Maimonides to Avadi the convert. Do not consider your origin inferior, while we, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you derive from him through whose word the world was created. Now from Judah Halevi, or more Maimonides, from Guide to the Perplexed. There's a group of human beings who consider a grievous thing that causes should be given for any law. What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. What compels them to feel this is a sickness that they find in their souls, a sickness to which they are unable to give utterance, and which they cannot furnish a satisfactory account, for they think that in those laws were useful in this existence and had been given to us for this or that reason. It would be as if they derived from this reflection and the understanding of some intelligent being. If, however, there is a thing for which the intellect could not find any meaning at all, and that does not lead to something useful, it undoubtedly derives from God, for the reflection of man would not lead to such a thing. It is as if, according to these people of weak intellects, man were more perfect than his maker, for man speaks and acts in a manner that leads to some intended end, whereas the deity does not act thus, but commands us to do things that are not useful to us and forbids us to do things that are not harmful to us. But he is far exalted above this. The contrary is the case, the whole purpose consisting of what is useful for us. Now, if there is a thing for which no reason is known, and that does not either procure something useful or ward off something harmful, why should one say of one who believes in it or practices it that he is wise and understanding and of great worth? And why should the religious communities think it a wonder? Rather, things are indubitably, as we have mentioned, every commandment from among the 613 commandments, either with a view to communicate a correct opinion, or to putting an end to an unhealthy opinion, or to communicate a rule of justice, or to warding off an injustice, or to endowing man with a noble moral quality, or warning them against an evil moral quality. Thus, all the commandments are bound up with three things: opinions, moral qualities, and political civic actions. Oops. Sorry, close that by accident. It is not possible, except through negation, to achieve an apprehension of that which is in our power to apprehend. On the other hand, negation does not give knowledge in any respect of that true reality of the thing which has been negated. All men affirm clearly that God cannot be apprehended by the intellects, and that none but he himself can apprehend what he is, and the apprehension of him consists of the inability to attain the ultimate term in apprehending him. Then notes that all philosophers say dazzled by God's beauty. Psalm 65, silence is praise to you. For whatever we say, intending to magnify and exalt you, we perceive it in some deficiency. So the Maimonidean controversy, with Solomon ben Ardit. Woe to mankind because of the insult to Torah, for they've strayed from it. Its diadem have they taken away, its crown they've removed. Every man with his censer in his hands offers incense before Greeks and Arab. Like Zimri, they publicly consort with the Midianites and revel in their own filth. They do not prefer the older Jewish teachings, but surrender to the newer Greek learning, the prerogatives due to their Jewish birthright. Therefore have we decreed and accepted for ourselves and our children that for the next 50 years, under the threat of the ban, no man in our community, unless he be 25 years old, shall study either the original language or translation of the books which the Greeks have written on religious philosophy and science. We have excluded from this our general prohibition, the science of medicine, even though it is one of the natural sciences, because the Torah permits the physician to heal. So you see that Maimonides' books were banned, and the rabbis of Europe didn't like the renewal of the Greek wisdom. We'll close with a quick quote from the Sefer Bahir in Zohar. But the world was created, an impulse arose in the divine mind to create a great shining light. A light so bright was created that no creature could control it. When God saw that no one could bear it, he took 1/7 and gave it to them in its place. The rest he did away for the righteous in the time to come. He said, if they prove worthy of the 7th and guard it, I will give them the rest in the world to come. And Rabbi Yehuda in the Zohar said, if the light were completely hidden, the world would not exist for even a moment. Rather, it is hidden, sown like a seed that gives birth to seed and fruit. Thereby the world is sustained. Every single day, a ray of light shines into the world and keeps everything alive. For with that ray, God feeds the world. And everywhere that Torah is studied at night, one thread-thin ray appears from that hidden light and flows down upon those absorbed in her. Since this first day, it has never been fully revealed, but it plays a vital role in the world, renewing each day the act of creation. Okay, so I wanted to open up with that Maimonides, who, God forbid, was excommunicated. His books were banned and burned. And Maimonides was a big fan of the Greeks and Greek wisdom. And as we get into the soul, we're going to start looking at this. What can the mind decipher from science? Versus what could be achieved from tradition, spirituality, and even to put this in terms of Platonic understanding. So, sorry, little disheveled. Okay, so on to humanism. Humanism, the quality of being man. So humanism, medieval Europe, revival of antiquity, belief in individual and potential of humans, embrace virtue, the quality of being man, idea of excelling in all pursuits. So the Latin and Greek after the fall of Constantinople, ancient text translated by 1500. That the former wisdom of the ancients is fully revived in Europe by the 1500s. Most of the things have been translated to Latin by then. Largely reject scholasticism in favor of Roman authors. Cicero, Virgil, Greek writers, Plato, very popular, and the early Christians. Creation of the liberal arts, the rise of universities, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, politics, moral philosophy. Civic humanism, preparing leaders. Humanism more secular and lay-dominated. So 7 liberal arts comprised 2 groups of study, the trivium and the quadrivium. Studies in the trivium included grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and studies in the quadrivium included arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. The term liberal in liberal arts is from the Latin word liberalis, meaning appropriate for free men, social and political elites, and they were contrasted with servile arts. The liberal arts thus initially represented the kind of skills and general knowledge needed by the elite echelon of society, whereas the servile arts represented specialized tradesmen skills and knowledge needed by the persons who were employed by the elite. The several liberal arts are part of the instruction of the fellowcraft degree, which will be part of Freemasonry. Hopefully we're going to move into after this series. So major figures of humanism, Petrarch, saying that literature was not substandard to religion, the Dark Ages, um, between the fall of Roman Empire and the Renaissance, and the textual analysis of ancient texts. And Boccaccio compiled Greek and Roman mythology, encyclopedia, Decameron, over 100 tales. Leonard Bruni, first person to actually use the word humanism, civic humanist. He writes the history of Florence. Lorenzo Valla, foremost expert in Latin language, writes on the false donation of Constantine, exposed the 8th century fraud, denied 4th century grant of territory, points out errors in the Latin Vulgate, but at the same time is a devout Catholic. And then Pico della Mirandola, Oration of Dignity of Man, most famous Renaissance work on the nature of humanism. Humans created God and given tremendous potential for greatness. Humans created by God and given tremendous potential for greatness, and even union with God if they desired it. Humans could also choose a negative course, thus humans had free will to be great or fail. And Baldassare Castiglione, the Book of Courtier, most important work on Renaissance education, outlines the qualities of a gentleman, described ideal Renaissance man. Medieval view, a person is a master in one area, the virtue, like we started at the beginning, the quality of being man. So, these concepts of humanism, very important. So let's look at Petrarch, very important humanist. So early humanists formed in a culture spiritually determined by mendicant friars, Dominicans, and Franciscans. Voluntary poverty was the center of true Christian conduct. 14th century scholarship shifted from the hands of the church to the hands of the laymen, such as lawyers and doctors. These men revived the classic studies of Greece and Rome. Instead of focusing exclusively on God and religion, they were more interested in human aspects such as culture, society, and values. So Salutati, principle of humanism. Salutati, man is responsible for his good and bad deeds. God does not control a man's will or morality. It is better to benefit others by living an active public life than to live as a monk, which does not benefit anyone other than the monk. Bruni, medieval values of piety, humility, and poverty not important. Attitudes about wealth, credit, finances, and usury modified. Pagan elements introduced into Christian culture. Emphasize the dignity and worth of the individual. People are rational beings who possess within themselves the capacity for truth and goodness. Emphasize the value of the Greek and Latin classics for their own sake, rather than for their relevance to Christianity. Collection and translation of classical manuscripts inspired by Plato. Aristotle-inspired medieval scholarship centered around education. Attempt to develop the character and intelligence of pupils by a general literary study of the ancient classics. So interest in grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and ethics as an alternative to the scholastics curriculum, which laid emphasis on logic, naturals, philosophy, medicine, law, and theology. Humanism was mostly a new educational discipline, not a philosophy of life. To write well and speak effectively, it is necessary to closely study, and to imitate the ancient classics. Create a new mental outlook by establishing that the study of ancient literature and the writing of the new works based on this inspiration contributes directly to the dignity, usefulness, and happiness of human beings. Stimulated critical attitudes and freed minds from the old system, lessened the ecclesiastical monopoly of learning, and challenged philosophy to deal with practical subjects such as ethics. Received ancient literary forms such as the dialogue, essay, familiar letter, comedy, tragedy, ode, and the literary treatment of history, biography, moral philosophy, and political theory. Ideal life is dedicated to scholarship. Values of the civics Romanus influenced and matured the idea of ceaseless activity of the mind. So new solutions to all political, social, artistic, and ethical problems could be found in the classics. Humanism sought for polish and elegance of diction, ease and wit and expression, and at the same time they wish to avoid involved arguments, subtle distinctions, and all obscure terminology. Restore the whole surviving heritage of Greek and Latin literature, edited all of it, and later brought out printed editions of the whole, introduced the idea of lay morality, which laid stress on ethical conduct as an end in itself, and increase the sense of dignity of man and emphasize what man can do for himself. So the factions of humanisms, you have the Stoic, rely on power of reason alone to achieve contentment. Neither material goods nor misfortune should have any meaning. Stoicism, the Christian framework, was popular in intellectual circles as a remedy for the affluent and commercialized age. Life of poverty is necessary for a wise man's independence of mind. Every step from poverty to wealth was bound to increase man's desire, greed, passion, unrest, and misery. So you have the Christian Neoplatonists and the Aristotelian Epicureans. So on to Francesco Petrarch. So he's born in Arezzo in 1304. His father was banished from Florence. He began to study law in 1316 due to his father's wishes. His father dies in 1326, and Petrarch abandoned his legal studies, discovered Cicero, Virgil, and the Latin classics, began his exclusive devotion to literature. 1927, Petrarch accepted minor ecclesiastical vows, but did not accept powerful or prestigious positions, traveled through Europe the next 10 years. 1340 is given the title of Poet Laureate, and 1353 returns permanently to Italy. So the two periods of Petrarch's life: great boldness influenced solely by ancient philosophers, ignored his true self because of too many distractions, fame of success of Laura Sonnets, title of Poet Laureate, awareness of the insufficiency of his earlier way of life, need to identify more closely with contemporary ways of thinking introduced during the Christian era. So the first modern intellect, Petrarch had a deep understanding of what ancient Latin and Greek literature had been in antiquity. He was very interested in making literature the greatest of intellectual activities, founded philology, the systematic and scientific study of all literary and linguistic phenomenon, made poetry his sole profession. So Petrarch on politics. He's not involved in politics. He had a sentimental and intellectual attachment to Italy. He's not interested in individual affairs or political affairs. I mean, he's only interested in individual affairs, not political affairs. Viewed Italy as a centralized unity under Rome and influenced by the history of classical times, had ideas of a republic or a universal empire. Petrarch believed in the Vitas Solitaria was the supreme standard for living. A truly wise man is focused on intellectual and spiritual matters, not distracting political problems. Petrarch on solitude felt that being alone in the absence of avarice was the secret to happiness. He was happiness when he lived by himself in his country home. He never truly integrated into any group or society that he joined. Autonomy and freedom were needed to apply himself into humanistic studies. So Petrarch and wealth. Petrarch hated wealth, power, and external honors. It was not the wealth itself that he hated, but the anxiety, toil, and trouble connected with it. He said that he would rather live in a bitter, abject poverty than be wealthy. At another time, however, he said that he would rather be wealthy because living in poverty is only bearable for those who do it in the name of Christ. One should not escape wealth, but one should not possess it with an avaricious mind. Petrarch is the humanist. He belonged to a Stoic faction. However, he often had warm emotional reactions, which are more characteristic of a Christian, not Stoic attitude. Felt that all medieval culture was uniformly barbarous. Classical-minded scholars and poets were needed to lead humanity away from the arid scholastic rationalizing and the cultural degradation into which it had been sunk ever since the barbarian migrations, influenced by Horace, Lucian, Statius, Persius, Juvenal, Martial, Cicero, Livy, Seneca, and Caesar. Petrarch wanted to pull himself out of the physical and mental world around him to live imaginatively in Roman antiquity, loved the classical ways of feeling, thinking, and writing, admired the polish, elegance, and perfection of the form of classics as opposed to un-Roman Latin of the Middle Ages, took words, methods, and sentence structure, figures of speech, and stories from the Latin classics and gave them a new European life. Petrarch had intellectual autonomy and an aesthetic, political, and moral outlook on life. Combined classic pagan and Christian medieval elements into universal humanism, which states that sentiments, conscience, and self-analysis are part of every human being, not just pagan or Christian. So all Petrarch's work contains self-analysis, meditation, internal dilemmas, and crisis concerning moral and cultural values. The secret conflict of my desires. Petrarch states that he had difficulties while attempting to resolve the inner conflicts between reason and emotion, puts forth the passions which had pushed him from one false petty goal to another, struggles to conquer the passions which stem from his lower nature. Kanzeri manifests the being of modern consciousness, awareness of the end of the great dogma of divine providence, which had held much power before. As a result, man realizes tragic destiny is isolation, analyzes a continuous sense of dissatisfaction, and oscillates between opposing feelings. Petrarch seeks the absolute divine and eternal, experiences anxiety because he cannot cast off his worldly concerns such as fame and glory and therefore cannot achieve spiritual peace. Surface meaning of the work indicates a story of an unfulfilled love and the different emotions that the lover goes through. However, there are no concrete facts to point to this interpretation. Petrarch's love for lore impedes his search for control over and distancing from his human aspirations and desires. Conflict between divinity, religion, reason, and humanity, desire, passion, enthusiasm, poetic activity. Petrarch searches for truth while at the same time experiencing conflict between what it is, what he is, and what he should be. And the style of work is based on classical Latin style. So Petrarch's letter to posterity, autobiography with moral considerations, classical style, statement about love really concern literature. I've always possessed an extreme content for wealth, not that riches are not desirable in themselves, but because I hate the anxiety and care which are invariable associated with them. I certainly do not long to be able to give gorgeous banquets. I have, on the contrary, led a happier existence with plain living and ordinary fare than all of the followers of Epicurus with their elaborate dainties. I fled, however, from many of those to whom I was greatly attached, and such was my innate longing for liberty that I studiously avoided those whose very name seemed incompatible with the freedom that I loved. I possessed a well-balanced rather than a keen intellect, one prone to all kinds of good and wholesome study, but especially inclined to moral philosophy and the art of poetry. Among the many subjects which interest me, I dwell especially on antiquity, for our own age has always repelled me, so that had it not been for those love of those dear to me, I should have preferred to have been born in any other period than our own. In order to forget my own time, I have constantly striven to place myself in spirit in other ages, and consequently, I am delighted in history. I gave up the subject of law altogether. However, so soon as it was no longer necessary to consult the wishes of my parents, my reason was that although the dignity of the law, which is doubtless very great, and especially the numerous references it contains to Roman antiquity, did not fail to delight me, I felt it to be habitually degraded by those who practiced it. Petrarch offered to bestow that honor. He offered to bestow that honor upon me at Naples and urged me to consent to receive it there, but my veneration for Rome prevailed over the insistence of even so great a monarch as Robert, who nowadays could hope to equal one who, in my judgment, was the greatest in an age fertile in great minds. Had I been a riper age, I should have desired it. The age loves what is practical, while impetuous youth longs only for what is dazzling. The laurel brought me no increase of learning or literary power, as you may well imagine, while it destroyed my peace by the infinite jealousy it aroused. I believe that I speak but the strict truth which I claim, that as there is none among earthly delights more noble than literature, so there is none so lasting nor gentle or more fruitful. There is none which accompanies its possessor through the vicissitudes of life at so small a cost of effort or anxiety. So Petrarch's contributions to humanism, recognition of the true features of classic Latin prose and poetry, admiration for Cicero, passion for collecting ancient manuscripts, perception that the future of classical scholarship depended on the recovery of Greek works, support for humanism among the rich and powerful, reconciliation between pagan and Christian ways of thinking. Petrarch was concerned with individual matters, not general problems. As a consequence, few humanists of the next generations were directly influenced by him. Petrarch did not influence many of his fellow humanists, either because his life was so different than theirs. He was an isolationist. However, Petrarch is still considered to be the father of humanism because he broke with the tradition and completely changed the way people thought, learned, and lived. Okay, so very interesting. Wanted to bring in some Petrarch there. And we keep moving forward with humanism. So let's look at Sir Thomas More in irony. Humanism and irony. Thomas More. So throughout the Middle Ages, the focus of scholars was on law, medicine, nature, and theology. Known as scholasticism, it valued rule of law, natural philosophy, healing, ultimate truths. And the Renaissance progressed, value changed to what became known as humanism. It valued the humanities, grammar, rhetoric, history, moral philosophy, all towards making people wise and virtuous citizens and rulers of rising concept of nation states. The 16th century humanism saw a rise in Northern Europe. Thomas More and Erasmus of Rotterdam were foundational. Humanism focused on the human individual, citizen, or ruler over nature or God. Humanism primary focus is the study of the book and the classical past. Favored manner of argument was to say, as the old author has written, and it led the transformative technology of Gutenberg, the printing press. So the basic idea of humanism is the appeal to nature. The seeming simple, plain, and ordinary English word nature is one of the most complex, far-reaching, important, and hard to pin down terms in the language. The Enlightenment would turn to the word nature towards its eventual reductive sense of the mechanical agglomeration of earth, air, water, plants, and animals, where the humanism affirmed the classical Roman meaning of nature as an objective guide and principle of life and conduct. Nature, an objective standard, external to mind, but fully accessible to it. Human nature is that which acts by instinct, habit, or will in accordance with that standard. Thus, humanism could affirm an objective, rational standard accessible by human reason and study, which was not primarily theological, but which was compatible with a religious view of the world and the coming of the great chain of beings. So, what's irony? A classical mode of oral and written expression. Irony is used as a practical method of teaching by Socrates and Plato among the Greek philosophers, and as a dramatic device by the Greek tragedians. Used as proof of sophistication and cleverness by the great Latin Roman essayist Cicero Lucian, and is valuable to Sir Thomas More for two reasons. As a humanist expression and demonstration, as safety, a double meaning at a time there was not only no freedom of expression, but also not freedom of thought. So irony defined the difference between what is said or shown and what is meant. Is the distance between statement and intention, promise and action, appearance and reality. Irony can suggest insincerity. An antonym or cure is sincerity or authenticity. So etymology from the Greek ironia, dissimulation, or iron, meaning an utterance or a situation that is different, often opposite to the literal one. Your comparative list, your humor, your discovery, wit, enlightenment, satire, an amendment, sarcasm, inflicting pain, invective, discrediting, cynicism, self-justification, irony, distance. So the historical development of the types of irony. So you have Socratic irony. Socratic irony is feigning ignorance in order to expose the weakness of another's position. Roman irony or rhetorical irony. Roman times irony was used in public speaking and rhetoric. Words used opposite their meaning or intent. A form of verbal irony. Use of words to convey something other than and especially the opposite of the literal meaning of the words. Famous Pride and Prejudice opening. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. Dramatic irony. Audience knows something the characters in a drama do not. So situational irony. People and events coming together in improbable situations, creating a tension between expected and real results. Situational irony occurs when the result of a situation are far different from what was expected. This results in a feeling of surprise and unfairness due to the odd situation. The irony of fate or cosmic irony or larger situational irony. The expression irony of fate stems from the notion that the gods or the fates are amusing themselves by toying with the minds of mortals with deliberate ironic intent. Minor examples of daily situations, such as the rain that sets in immediately after one finishes watering one's garden, following many days of putting off watering in anticipation of rain. That life is unfair. Historical irony, cosmic irony over time. So technocracy, ruled by technologists. Technocracy idea popularized in the 1930s. Scientists and technical experts in administrative or decision-making, management, and political positions. Government, technical, scientific decision-making, rational ordering of human behavior and social conduct. Technocracy lost social credibility via its advocacy of eugenics. Okay, so it's interesting. A little history of irony in its relationship to the rise of humanism. So let's look at the Renaissance. Humanism largely arose as part of the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, after the 13 to 1500s, Western Europe enjoyed a golden age in the arts and literature. Known as the Renaissance, the word literally means rebirth. The Renaissance was a time of great creativity and change in many areas: economic, political, social, and above all, cultural. New world viewed, rediscovered interest in Greek and Roman philosophers, rebirth after disorder and disunity in the late Middle Ages, focused on the here and now rather than the afterlife. Ideal Renaissance person was multi-talented, spirited of adventure and curiosity, exploration. Renaissance humanism focused on secular subjects, looking at the importance of humans. The main Renaissance started in Italy. If you look at medieval Europe, for the 1,000 years prior, after the fall of Rome, till about the 1300s, it was agricultural, not too much long-distance trade between country, focus on religion. Most studies of any form were religious in nature. Individual achievement less highly valued. Classical works are preserved, but not focus of scholars. And then the Renaissance comes. It's more urban society, long-distance trade increases, focus on the humanities and study, celebrates individual achievement. Scholars and others have renewed interest in classical works of ancient Greece and Rome. So the famous Medici family, you see an increase in their wealth and power. The flourishing of art during the Renaissance. Architecture, painting, sculpture, glorious expression. Wealthy patrons played a major role in the artistic flowering. Popes and princes, along with successful merchants, supported the works of hundreds of artists. Art reflects new ideas and attitude, focused on the individual, produced portraits of famous figures of the time, had Greek and Roman influences throughout. And architecture. Some nice pictures. See, poets, artists, and scholars mingles with politicians at the courts of Renaissance rulers. A literature how-to book sprang up to help ambitious men and women who wanted to rise in the Renaissance world. You have Castiglione's Ideal Courtier, a how-to book on the gain influence and power in courts, and Machiavelli's Advice to Princes. Ends justify the means. Political ambition caused people to look at politics differently. Ambitious goals and power focused. And the Renaissance spreads into Northern Europe, which had been really damaged by the plague, the Black Death. So, like Italian humanist, Northern European humanist scholars stressed education and classical learning. At the same time, they emphasized religious themes. They believed that the revival of ancient learning should be used to bring about religious and moral reform. So, you had Erasmus called for reform in the church, wanted the Bible to be the vernacular. Sir Thomas More publishes Utopia, called for economic and social reforms. Rebellious' comic masterpiece, printed in the vernacular, argued for social change. Shakespeare explores universal themes, focused on everyday realistic events, humanism. So Desiderius Erasmus, pitcher, Dutch priest, and humanist scholar, was active in the Northern European Renaissance. He believed individuals' chief duties were to be open-minded and show goodwill towards others. And then you have the printing press, printing revolution. Gutenberg, 1456. Very quickly afterwards, spreads all over. Here's a nice chart. by 1500, 50 years later, there's 50 printing presses through Europe. Claim that the number of books in Europe in 1455 was 30,000. The number in 1500 were 10 million. Used to take months to produce, a large book that could be produced by a printing press in one day. Picture of Gutenberg in Germany. Leonardo da Vinci. So you got then the Protestant Reformation. During the Renaissance, Christians from all levels of society grew impatient with the corruption of the clergy and the worldliness of the Roman Catholic Church. In the words of one unhappy peasant, instead of saving the souls of the dead and sending them to heaven, the clergy gorged themselves at banquets after funerals. They're wicked wolves. They would like to devour us all, dead or alive. So there's abuses in the church. So you have early reformers. John Wycliffe called reform stop selling indulgences. John Hus argued for vernacular. During the Middle Ages, the church is the center of almost all communities across Europe. Martin Luther, full-scale revolt. Nice picture. The 795 Theses. Excommunication by the Pope, by Emperor Charles V. Made it illegal to support Luther, although many did. So Luther's teaching, salvation could only be achieved through faith alone. Bible was source of all information. Church hierarchy did not have special powers. 5 of the 7 sacraments he did not agree with. Gained followers called Lutherans or Protestants. Then you have John Calvin, the wake of Luther's revolt against the church. Other reformers challenged church authority. The most important was John Calvin, who lived in what's today Switzerland. Calvin had a razor-sharp mind, and his ideas had a profound effect on the direction of the Protestant Reformation. Calvin's teachings in 1536, Institutes of the Christian Religion, set forth beliefs and organization, set up Protestant theocracy in Geneva, Switzerland. Individuals traveled from all over Europe to observe Geneva and recreate. Calvin's ideas spread by the late 1500s. Calvinism spread to Germany, France, England, Scotland, and the Netherlands. By this time, multiple wars started between Calvinist, Lutheran, and Calvinist organizations. So there's a nice chart breaking down Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, salvation, sacraments, church hierarchy, Bible, and belief, revelation. So salvation in Catholicism, salvation is achieved through faith and good works. Lutheranism, salvation is achieved through faith. In Calvinism, God alone predetermines who will be saved. Sacraments. Catholicism, priests perform 7 sacraments or rituals: baptism, confirmation, marriage, ordination, communion, anointing of the sick, and repentance. Lutheranism accepts some of the sacraments but reject others because the rituals cannot erase sin, only God can. Calvinism accepts some of the sacraments, the same as Lutheranism. Catholicism, the church is headed by the Pope. Lutheranism, you have an elected councils. And Calvinism, you have a council of elders. So in the Bible, Catholicism, Bible is one source of truth, church tradition is another. Lutheranism and Calvinism, Bible alone is the source of truth. So the Revelation in Catholicism, priests interpret the Bible and church teachings for the people. Lutheranism, people read and interpret the Bible for themselves. Same in Calvinism. So the iconoclasm, the getting rid of pictures in Calvinist churches. And then the scientific revolution, the last part of the Renaissance looked at in these slides. The Renaissance and Reformation looked to the past for models. Humanists turned to ancient learning classics. Religious reformers looked to the Bible and early Christian times for inspiration. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry led scientists to explore beyond the knowledge of the ancients. So the old views, Greek philosophers and the church both said the earth was the center of the universe. Then 1543, Nicholas Copernicus changes, say the sun's the center. That we've went over this many times, that history. So you got the creation of the scientific method, and then Descartes and Bacon, who we've discussed in the previous parts about science. And then with that, you have dramatic discoveries in the sciences, especially medicine and chemistry, which we have went over in other slides. Okay, so great stuff. A lot to cover. Keep on going through. Yeah, good stuff. So let's look at one more. This one in the Renaissance is a lot of pictures, and just putting in this humanistic, understanding. We've looked at the science, and now, it's a lot of thought. What happened in the Renaissance, where you had the revival of the ancients, and then this new mode of thinking that created new discoveries. You have to see what's worthy of taking from the ancients and what's worthy from taking from the new. So we look to the Renaissance for how to look at these things related to consciousness. So beginning of the Renaissance, you have the Black Death, warfare taking over Europe, catastrophic events, decrease in population. And so the beginning of the Renaissance, you're going to see the rise of city-states, nationalism. You have, the divided Italy. If people are familiar with the history of Italy. Nice pictures, your famous cities like Venice, beautiful area, Milan, Florence, a lot of places of wealth. This return to the urban area and increased intellectualism. So you led to the new ideas. So the idea of a rebirth, inspiration from the ancients, new world of ideas, more reading, Arabic translations to the Greeks, multiple viewpoints, belief in human capacity to achieve marvelous things. The humanities, interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture, characteristic of good education. Scholastic education gave way to classics, rhetoric, grammar, poetry, history, Latin, Greek. Subjects came to be known as humanities, movement that inspired the movement known as humanism. Humanists emphasized individual accomplishments. The roots trace back to Dante. The work continued glimpses of what would become focused on human nature. Historians believe Renaissance began with two humanists who lived after Dante, Boccaccio and Petrarch, who we spoke about. Both wrote literature in everyday language, not Latin. Advances were made in medicine as well as astronomy. So Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, fathers of humanism. Here's a Savonarola, Dominican friar who decried money and power. Anti-humanist, saw humanism as too secular, hedonistic, and corrupting. He wrote the Bonfire of the Vanities, burned books, artwork, jewelry, and other luxury goods in public. Even Botticelli put some of his paintings in the fire. And then Savonarola is executed in 1452. Encourage people to look into this history. Very interesting. So then you have humanism seems to win out over the censors to some extent. You have secular writers. Life in Italy seems insecure and precarious. Church no longer served as a source of stability and peace. Forms of humanism developed from Petrarch's ideas. Focus was secular, worldly rather than spiritual. You had this concept of service. Humanists argued that individual achievement, education could be fully expressed only if people use talents, abilities in service of cities. You have the concept of the Renaissance man. Ideal Renaissance man came to be universal man, accomplished in classics, but also a man of action who could respond to all situations. The example of a Renaissance man, how to act, Italian diplomat Castellani, his book The Courtier, the how-to books describe how a perfect Renaissance gentleman should act. Books include fictional conversations between dukes and guests. So Castellani's advice, Castellani gave nobles new rules for refined behavior in humanist society, speaks of serious, well-assuming subjects, should be acquainted with poetry, history, prose, and to know how to rule. You have Machiavelli, the Prince. Nice pictures. So Machiavelli's advice seemed to encourage harsh treatment of citizen. Rival states describes men as ungrateful, fitful, liars, and deceivers. Advises rulers to separate morals from politics. Power ruthlessness more useful than idealism. Ruler must do whatever necessary to maintain political power, even if cruel. Machiavelli's theory that the end justifies the means, deviated from accepted views of correct behavior, idea that the state, an entity in and of itself, separate from its ruler, became foundation for later political philosophy. Then you have science in the Renaissance, scientific information. Humanists searched archives, Arab translations for classical text, discovered wealth of scientific information. In the natural world, focus of Renaissance on human scientists, history, politics, geography. New ideas about the natural world began to be explored. Scientific challenges. Science soon became important avenue of inquiry. The church teachings about the world were changed, particularly the earth is the center of the universe. We've discussed this history many times already. Copernicus, Galileo. So, overview, quick causes of the Renaissance: increased trade with Asia and other regions as a result of the Crusades, growth of large, wealthy city-states in Italy, renewed interest in the classics, learnings of ancient Greek and Rome, rise of rich and powerful merchants who became patrons of the art, increased desire for scientific and technical knowledge, desire to create beautiful cities. So inspiration from the ancient Greeks and Romans, humanism, secular focus, new theories in science. So Renaissance arts. The arts are a reflection of the new humanist spirit. Medieval artists idealized in symbolic representations. Renaissance artists depicted what they observed in nature. So they have these new patrons of the arts. Medieval times, anonymous artists who worked for church created art. Renaissance artists worked for whoever offered them highest price. Buyers of art's patron might be wealthy individuals, city governments, or church. Competition among patrons. Wealthy individuals competed, displaying wealth, modernity through purchase of artwork. The Medicis in the Sforza of Milan. And Renaissance artists wanted to paint the natural world as realistically as possible. Medici and Sforza. So styles and technique, artist method, studied perspective, representing three-dimensional objects, experimented with using color to portray shapes, textures, subject matter change. Artists began to paint, sculpt scenes from Greek, Roman myths. So clear classical influence, religious paintings focused on personality, humanist interest in classical learning, human nature, building design reflected humanist reverence for Greek, Roman culture, and classical architecture favored. So some of these Renaissance paintings, you have the return of nudes in the Renaissance that had died out with the rise of Christianity. This new concept of perspective. To make three-dimensional images look accurate on a two-dimensional platform. So interesting mathematics. Anyone who's could be interesting. You see the rise of mathematics related to this. Geometric arrangements and figures. You see the use of triangles, very geometric in these Renaissance paintings, even though the shapes aren't necessarily in the painting, but they follow these geometric patterns. You get what we call classicism, Greco-Roman influence, secularism, humanism, individualism, freestanding figures, symmetry and balance. The liberation of sculpture. Look at David by Donatello, 1430, first free-form bronze since the Roman times. Brunelleschi, the dome architecture. A lot of this stuff still standing till today. Look at Leonardo da Vinci, talented in all fields, Italian polymath, scientist, mathematician, engineer, inventor, atomist, painter, sculptor, architect, botanist, musician, writer. 20,000 pages of notes. Michelangelo, studied anatomy. Statue of David. There's some Michelangelo's notebooks. Anatomy. Geometric method in Leonardo da Vinci's paintings. Perspective. You see the difference from Dante to Michelangelo and the two Davids for 100 years. Your Sistine Chapel. Raphael. School of Athens. Bramante, St. Peter's Basilica, the School of Athens, famous School of Athens, Raphael. So he's in his own picture. You can see the Greeks and the different scholars of over 2,000 years incorporated into this painting. Zoroaster, Ptolemy, Euclid, like they're all in conversation with each other, possibly like what resurrection of the dead will look like when the great men of all different generations stand together. So this one really had some nice pictures and ground in the power of the Renaissance at time. And got one last PowerPoint on humanism here. We're going to say liberal humanism, which comes kind of post-Renaissance before we move into utilitarianism. Liberal humanism, philosophical roots. Liberal humanism, philosophical thoughts contribute to modern beliefs in a reality that can be known directly through the senses and through the employment of rational thought. Liberal humanism inspired a scientific, rational worldview that placed the knowing individual at the center of history and viewed the history as the progress of Western thought, served as a catalyst for the modern world reliance on individualism and the belief in the common human nature, scientific rationality, and the search for truth as universal knowledge and certainty in the world. Of the many schools of thought inspired by liberal humanism, two directly inform modern reading practices, empiricism and rationalism. Though Western empiricism finds the earliest inspiration in Aristotle, it took its modern form following the great 17th and 18th century thinkers of Britain, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Empiricism posits that all factual knowledge is based on our sensual experience and inner reflection. That is, there is a reality independent of the mind that can be experienced. And while different schools of empiricist thought interpret key terms such as experience, fact, and world differently, they generally hold that the mind comes to acquire knowledge about the world in systematic means, including induction and the scientific method. Rationalism, a school of thought with its early Western roots in the dialogues of Plato, claim as the modern proponents, the 17th and 18th century philosophers Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Rationalism is characterized by the belief that knowledge of the world can be attained through reason, that this knowledge is universal and deductive in character, and that everything is fundamentally explainable by this universal system. This worldview, while at odds with certain fundamental tenets of empiricism, finds its greatest expression in the fields of logic and mathematics. So you have the creation of the modern self. Before the Renaissance, Western society defined the self by its location within both a secular and divine order. The center of pre-modern epistemology was the great chain of being, in which all members of society had a proper place. With the rise of the Renaissance humanism and the Enlightenment, however, the individual began to be conceived as a sovereign and epistemological center. This reconfiguration of the self, spurred by historical events such as the Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Revolution, ultimately led to the systemic examination of the modern self. Although many participated, four of the more influential theorists were Immanuel Kant, René Descartes, and John Locke. Kant asserted that the definitive characteristic of the human self was the capacity for reason. Reason allowed the self to understand and order the world with certainty. According to Kant, reason is the faculty which supplies the principle of a priori knowledge, and pure a priori principles are indispensable for the possibility of experience. For whence could experience derive its certainty if all the rules according to which it proceeds were always themselves empirical and therefore contingent? Defining humans by their capacity for a priori reasoning reveals that the essence of the Kantian self is individual and impervious to experience. Kant deduced further that the self he envisions was unitary, proceeding from the notion of unitary self or self-consciousness, governed by a capacity for reason that is unaffected by the particularities of experience. Kant felt that pure reason both enabled and compelled humans to construct a transcendental philosophy that articulated the structure of the order of the experiential world. Locke shared with Kant the belief that humans were essentially individualistic and defined by their capacity for reason. The general beliefs of liberal humanism: absolute truth, world can be controlled and ordered, we can picture and represent the world, belief in linear progress, universality means text must be studied in isolation, context, personal ideologies, human nature is unchanging, people's individual personality is transcendent, purpose, humanist enhancement of life. Liberal humanist subject, the notion that we have a more or less stable self-concept, the idea that we have more or less stable and coherent self, the often called the Cartesian self from Descartes. This Cartesian liberated and autonomous subject is in charge of him, herself, and engages, or at least is incapable of engaging in rational debate with other subjects to arrive at a consensus. Conception of the self as subject, self or subject is fundamental to humanism and underlies, for example, typical understanding of liberal democracy. Understanding the self as somehow having uniquely individual core, somehow sheltered from cultural forces, the modernist notion of the individual self with individual rights, including the right to self-fulfillment, self-realization, the pursuit of happiness, the right to property, the right to self-expression, to the free and full development of his personality. Individualism, a political and social philosophy that emphasizes individual liberty, a belief in the primary importance of the individual and in the virtues of self-reliance and personal independence, embraces opposition to authority and to all manner of controls over the individual, especially when exercised by state or society, directly opposed to collectivism, but can exist in a community where individuals respect other individuals, may derive from belief in solipsism and often confused with egoism. So Stuart Hall, three conceptions of the self: Enlightenment subject, the sociologist subject, and the postmodernist subject. The Enlightenment subject, highly individualist Cartesian subject with some kind of essential, stable center or core. The sociological subject, conception of self, while still adhering to the notion of inner core of self, examining how the self was shaped and developed by significant others, reference groups, and so on, and is, of course, central to the understanding of the notion of socialization. Postmodern subject, which is often referred to as the decentered subject, in which there is no stable core identity. If there appears to be, then that is only because of the narrative of the self, which we have constructed, and such narratives are themselves the product of social intercourse. Okay, so thus concludes my introduction to humanism. I have a few people here. Not sure if I got slides on utilitarianism, so I just wanted to I'm going to do one more on linguistics, and I got one last paper to read, so I wanted to give a break, opening up some slides on utilitarianism. Was really good, powerful stuff. And, to complete and round off the study of consciousness, you really need a whole, there's really quite a bit of work here. So I'm glad to be rounding off this trip. About 100 hours of research I spent in this. I'm happy I did it. So let me prepare these slides for utilitarianism. And then I'll go into existentialism, just see kind of the rise of the modern perspective. And to some extent, utilitarianism is probably one of the main paradigms of modern society, and existentialism. And, so I wanted to make sure I covered those and, show the kind of thought pattern that that is basically dominating the thought of the West on these topics and related to empiricism and science. And 1 second, something's wrong. So let's see what I got. Sorry, just preparing my stuff. Okay, so I'm getting this prepared. Okay. So I got my headphone in, so if you join, Babs, it's fine. Just start talking. I should hear you. My headphone's in, so I'm going to start introducing utilitarianism. So, introduction to the philosophy of utilitarianism. Ethics or moral philosophy is a branch of philosophy that investigates concepts of rights and wrong conduct. You got meta-ethics, normative ethics, and descriptive ethics. Meta-ethics studies the meaning of moral language and metaphysics of moral facts. Oh, sorry, forgot to re-enter screen share. Sorry. Re-enter screen share. Okay, so introduction to philosophy of utilitarianism is that you got meta-ethics, normative ethics, and descriptive ethics. Meta-ethics studies the meaning of moral language and the metaphysics of moral facts. Normative ethics examines standards for the rightness and wrongness of actions, and descriptive ethics is an empirical investigation of people's moral beliefs. Then you have virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. Virtue ethics focuses on the inherent character of a person rather than specific actions. Deontology argues that decisions should be made concerning the factors of one's duties and one's rights. Consequentialism argues that the morality of an action is contingent on the action's outcome or result. You have virtue ethics. You have Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Anscombe, the inherent character of a person rather than specific actions. So moral virtue, for example, courage in the face of fear, temperance in the face of pleasure and pain, liberality with wealth and possessions, magnificent with great wealth and possessions, magnanimity with great honors, proper ambition with normal honors, truthfulness with self-expression, wittiness in conversation, friendliness in social conduct, modesty in the face of shame and shamelessness, righteous indignation in the face of injury. Some philosophers criticize virtue ethics as culturally relative, since different people, cultures, and society often have different opinions on what constitutes a virtue. Perhaps there is no one objectively right. Another objection to virtue theory is that it does not focus on what sorts of actions are morally permitted and which ones are not, but rather on what sorts of qualities someone ought to foster in order to become a good person. This particular feature of the theory makes virtue ethics useless as a universal norm of acceptable conduct suitable as a base for legislation. So we deontology, that argues for the decision should be made considering the factors of one's duties and one's rights. So you have Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, roots morality in humanity's rational capacity and asserts certain inviolable moral laws. John Rawls' counterculturalism holds the moral acts are those that we would all agree to if we were unbiased. Natural rights theories such as John Locke or Robert Nozick holds that human beings have absolute natural rights. So Kant's categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim by which you can also will that it will become a universal law. So consequentialism argues that morality of action is contingent on the action's outcome of results. Welfarism argues the best action is the one that most increases economic well-being or welfare. Egoism is the belief that the moral person is the self-interested person, holds that action is right if it maximizes good for the self. Utilitarianism holds that action is right if it leads to the most happiness for the greatest number of people. So the famous utilitarianism is Bentham, Stuart Mill, you include Peter Singer. And you're looking to act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, total versus average, your possible problems, justice, predicting consequences. So you want to get into here this utilitarianism, very important. And so I got a few more presentations on this concept of utilitarianism. Okay, so utilitarianism is its origins in the hedonism of the ancient Cyrenaics and Epicureans. The originator of modern utilitarianism is Jeremy Bentham, 18th century English philosopher, sought to make ethics quantitative as Sir Isaac Newton had made science. Foundation is utilitarianism. All humans by nature seek to attain pleasure and avoid pain. Nature has packed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters. Pain and pleasure is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as what to determine what she shall do. On the other hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In other words, a man may pretend to adjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. So in taking this view of human nature, Bentham follows Hobbes and Hume, as well as the ancient Cyrenaics and Epicureans. So all humans by nature seek utility. Utility is a balance of pleasure over pain. By utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasures, good or happiness. All this is the present case comes to the same thing, or it comes to the same thing to prevent the happiness of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. You have egalitarianism. Every individual's utility counts the same as every other individual's utility. Thus, the proper goal of morality is to achieve the most overall utility. The community is a fictitious body composed of individual persons who are considered constituting, as it were, its members. The interest of the community then is what? The sum of the interest of the several members who compose it. For Bentham, utility is judged quantitatively only. There is no accounting for the alleged quality of utility. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and scientists of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more utility, it is more valuable than either. So Bentham's 7 quantitative utilitarian criteria: intensity, how strong is it; duration, how long does it last; certainty, how likely is it to happen; propinquity, how near is it at hand; fecundity, how likely it is to produce more; purity, how free of pain is it; extent, the number of people affected by it. How do you make a utilitarian moral choice? Determine who is affected by your choice. Determine your alternatives. Use the 7 criteria. Determine the utility for each affected individual for each alternative. Sum of the total utilities for each alternative. Choose the alternative that yields the most overall utility. Rule Utilitarianism. Doing utilitarian analysis for every moral choice is virtually impossible. Thus, most contemporary utilitarians prefer rule utilitarianism that follows the rule that in the long run produce the most overall utility. With rule utilitarianism, the utilitarian analysis is done only once when deciding which rules to follow. After that, moral choice is just a matter of following the rules. So objections to utilitarianism: humans are too noble for a morality that only seeks to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Bentham's response: get over it. Humans are nothing more than pleasure seekers and pain avoiders. So John Stuart Mill, 19th century English philosopher, Bentham's godson, tried to reform utilitarianism so that quality, not just quantity, matters when evaluating utility. If one of two pleasures is by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison a small amount. So what does this really prove? Mill is an elitist, biases. Few human creatures would consent to be changed in any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of the beast's pleasure. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. They would not resign what they possess more than he for the most complete satisfaction of all the desires which they have in common with him. It is better that a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The only party to the comparison knows both sides. So it boils down, Mill is saying if you want to know what pleasures are qualitatively better, ask a person of culture and refined taste. In other words, ask a person that thinks like I do. Mill's attempt to introduce a qualitative element into utilitarianism is generally considered a failure. The good of many outweighs the good of the few. Utilitarianism seems to allow sacrificing the individual for the good, the utility of the group. So is that just? The consequence is contrary to the intuition that each human person has inherent dignity that should not be sacrificed, no matter how much society as a whole gains from the sacrifice. So, nice further introduction to utilitarianism. and keep on going with this. So let's look further this concept of utilitarianism maximizing good. So Jeremy Bentham, there he is. I forget what university that is in England, where he's been like mummified, and you could see his body. Principle of utility, maximize good. The greatest happiness of the whole community ought to be the end subject of pursuit. The right and proper end of government in every political community is the greatest happiness of all the individuals of which it is composed. Say, in other words, the greatest happiness, the greatest number. Bentham's principle. By the principle of utility is meant the principle which approves or disapproves every action whatsoever according to the tendency. It appears to have augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. John Stuart Mill, the creed which accepts the foundation of morals, utility of the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Consequences, consequentialism, an act's value depends on its consequences, effect on the amount of good. Universalism, everyone's good counts equally. Motives and intentions, utilitarians treat what comes before the act as relevant, but only because of the consequences. An intention is good if it tends to lead to good actions. A motive is good if it tends to lead to good intentions. A character trait is good if it tends to lead to good motives. A person is good if he or she tends to have good character traits. A society is good if it tends to have good people. So intrinsic good, maximize what? Utilitarians need a theory of basic or intrinsic good. Moral good equals maximizing basic good. So what's basic good? You have hedonism. Intrinsic good is happiness. So what's happiness? Happiness. Bentham and Mill, pleasure and the absence of pain. Hedonism, pleasure, and pain are the only sources of value. So Bentham's utilitarianism, a good act increases the balance of pleasure over pain in the community. A bad act decreases it. The best acts maximize the balance of pleasure over pain. We must consider not just ourselves, but everyone affected. Individualism, effect on community, is some effect of members. So you have this form of moral calculus, people affected, pleasure, pain, difference. So Bentham's argument, common sense, moral judgments. Arguments for other principles. When resolving conflicts, we must have a measure of value that allows us to do that. So Bentham's against conscious. Principles of sympathy and antipathy tend to severity and leniency. Capricious people's reactions differ. Confuse motive with justification. Then you have Carlyle's objection. Thomas Carlyle calls utilitarianism a pig philosophy. Good only means feeling good. Qualities of pleasure. Mill, pleasures differ in quality as well as quantity. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. We're capable of better pleasures than pigs are. So how do you judge quality? Intellectual, social, sensual. You have virtue. Even if higher pleasures were not more intrinsically valuable, utilitarianism would not be pig philosophy. Higher pleasures, virtues, benefit for other. So Bentham agrees that pleasures differ in quality. In regard to well-being, quality as well as quantity requires to be taken into account. He has an entire chapter on kinds of pleasures. But Bentham thinks you are the most competent judge of quality for you. Quantity depends upon general sensibility to pleasure and pain in general. Quality upon particular sensibility, upon a man's being more sensible to pleasure or pain from this or that source than to ditto from this or that other. So Bentham on liberty. I can know quality for me by reflection, but I can judge qualities for others only by what they say and do. So each man could judge best for him or herself. Every man is a better judge of what is conducive to his or own well-being than any other man can be. In Mill on liberty, the harm principle, the only justification for restricting liberty is harm to others. Self-regarding actions, sphere of liberty, we ought to be free to do what we please so long as we don't violate someone else's right. In Mill on rules, principle of utility justifies acts. It need not be motivational or even a practical test. We apply it by secondary principles. Common sense, moral rules justify these rules by utility. appeal to the principle of utility only when secondary principles conflict. Back to Maimonides, who I started up today, who to some extent you consider utilitarianism, reconciling faith with reasons. Maimonides says that the 613 commandments are consistent with reason. All those pertaining to human relations required by reason maximize good. Maimonides, happy good, happiness is intrinsically good, but so is virtue. People seek to be kind, brave, generous for their own sakes, even at the expense of happiness. Intrinsic good, feeling good plus being good. So Maimonides on rule utilitarianism, act according to the rules that maximize the good. Kinds of acts are fundamental. Judge individual acts by rulers, justify rules as maximizing good. So act first, rule utilitarianism, act utilitarianism of Bentham, and act is right if it maximizes good. Rule utilitarianism, Maimonides, and act is right if it accords with the rules that maximize good. So they disagree when a rule conflicts with utility. So Maimonides on breaking rules. What if we can do better by breaking a good rule? Don't break it. Rules essential to moral thought. We're tempted to break rules for our own advantage. Will usually go wrong. Moral chaos. So interpreting Mill. Is Mill act or rule utilitarian? Greatest happiness principle speaks of acts, but he stresses secondary principles. In Mill, breaking rules. He's got a letter to John Verne. Advocates act utilitarianism, but agrees with Maimonides. If we break a rule, we'll usually go wrong, so better to obey rules. Act utilitarianism is right, but act as a rule utilitarian. Act utilitarianism tells us what makes right acts, but rule utilitarianism is better practical test. Okay, so interesting comparing Maimonides as utilitarianism. And, people have been following this for a while. I think a lot of these brain is a prediction machine and the most modern understandings of consciousness from a material level are largely utilitarianism. Okay, so I got three more here on utilitarianism. So let's look at more Bentham and Mill, really ground this down. You see the foundation for modern philosophy. So here's a nice timeline of Bentham, Mill, around the same time as Kant and Mozart or Thomas Jefferson. Mill's about the same time as Lincoln. Bentham's largely the first person to fully endorse the principle of utility. An action is right as it tends to promote happiness, wrong as it tends to diminish it, for the party whose interests are in question. And he has this hedonic calculus. So one goal of utilitarianism is to provide a way to resolve moral disputes. Bentham notes that if we can all agree that good equals pleasure, then we can make moral progress scientifically by determining which actions really do produce the most pleasure. His view is often called hedonistic utilitarianism. So hedonistic utilitarianism, our central obligation is to act so as to produce the most good pleasure, that we need a way to calculate which alternative actions open to us at a given time the best productive or most good pleasure. So Bentham, we said, is 7 pleasures: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. Mill is the one who added the 7th criterion. Bentham only suggested it. And Mill took Bentham's utilitarianism, made 2 major changes. He emphasized the greater good for the greatest number, rejected Bentham's calculus, saying that quality of pleasures is crucial in deciding what is right, not mere quantity. So what justifies the distinction between higher and lower pleasures? Mill gives 2 reasons. He famously says it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. He also said that only the competent judge of 2 things is someone with experience of both, and if one has 2 pleasures, is placed by such competent person so far above the other that they prefer it and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure, which their nature is capable of. We are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superior in quality. so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison a small account. Small. So utilitarianism, problem solving. Well, many agree with Mill that there is a qualitative difference between pleasures. That admission to a large degree ruins our ability to quantify pleasure, and so it ruins some of the problem-solving appeal of utilitarianism. So our religious pleasures higher than humanistic intellectual pleasures? Are the pleasures of childhood higher than those of young adult? Are they different in kind? And demanding theory. Utilitarianism accepts and emphasizes the distinction between what is in our self-interest and our duty. As soon as the happiness of two other people's conflicts with your own happiness, you lose out. Being a moral person quickly becomes quite difficult. So you have criticisms. Utilitarianism requires that we choose the act that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Does that apply to all our acts? Does utilitarianism do justice to justice? Is utilitarianism prejudiced about the future? Utilitarianism seems to require that we violate people's rights on occasion for the greater good. You consider the problems listed in the last few slides, or the trolley problem. So Mill on liberty. So Mill's philosophically radical idea that as long as you're not hurting others, you are free to do whatever you please with your own mind and body. Isn't that different from the medieval conception of ethics as concerned with duty versus interest, or what you owe to others, God and other humans, versus what you can permit for yourself? It is different, though, because in the Middle Ages, you would have been hard-pressed to find someone permitting as much freedom as Mill had in mind. So the harm principle, the only end for which people are entitled individually or collectively to interfere with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection, the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over a member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. But what constitutes harm? Free speech. Mill argues the value of free speech. No idea should be rejected out of hand, and no idea should be forbidden from consideration. No legislator or executive whose interests aren't exactly the same as the people's should be allowed to tell them what to believe or decide what doctrines or arguments they should be allowed to hear. If the arguments of my present chapter have any validity, there ought to exist the fullest liberty of proclaiming and discussing as a matter of ethical conviction any doctrine, however immoral it may be considered. But can't speech harm? Mill distinguishes between speech that violates rights and speech that merely harms someone. He allows for speech that harms so long as speech is responsible. True speech that harms is immune from censure unless spoken at a time that incites the violation of rights. Okay, pretty interesting. I got one last presentation on utilitarianism, actually two. So we do some more Mill, try to really get this down. So Mill had a lifelong goal of reforming the world in the interest of human well-being. The nice chart, person, intention, motive, habitual disposition, and the action consequence. Consequentialism, whether an act is morally right depends only on its consequences as opposed to the intrinsic nature of the act or anything that happens before the act. Hedonistic consequentialism, value hedonism, all and only pleasure is intrinsically valuable and all and only pain is intrinsically disvaluable. Hedonistic consequentialism, we can determine the moral value of consequences and thereby of acts by how much pleasure pain is produced. Utilitarianism, there ought either to be some one fundamental principle or law at the root of all morality, or if there be several, there should be a determinate order of proceeding among them. The greatest happiness principles, actions are morally right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, morally wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So simplified version of Mill, we can judge the moral value of actions by the degree of happiness they tend to produce. Groups. What about groups? further, you're looking at the desired ends, highest good. End of human action is necessarily also the standard of morality. So here's the argument for using the greatest happiness principle for moral judgment. Pleasure is the only intrinsic value. So we should use happiness measured in pleasure and reduction of pain to evaluate actions morally. What matters in evaluating actions is their consequences for happiness. Therefore, we should use the greatest happiness principle to evaluate actions morally. So what kind of consequences? Actual consequences, intended consequences, usual consequences for this kind of act. So that's Mill's opinion. You should use the usual consequences. And the consequences for whom? Sentient beings, for the whole world. Is there impartial on this? So Mill distinguishes between intellectual and sensual pleasures. Those who have higher experience both prefer the higher intellectual pleasures, although many prefer the sensual pleasures. So do we have to calculate consequences each time we act? And said, no, we could use the subordinate principle from the fundamental principle of the general happiness principle, based these on experience of which kinds of actions tend to promote more or less pleasure and pain. The greatest happiness principle, acts are morally right to the degree that they tend to produce happiness. So use the greatest happiness principle to determine subordinate rules by asking about usual tendencies of kinds of actions. So further arguments for the greatest happiness principle. Pleasure, happiness is the only thing desirable as an end goal of human action, the only intrinsically good thing. We should use the only intrinsically good thing to decide which acts are morally right or wrong. More of what is intrinsically good is better than less. Therefore, we can judge which acts are morally right or wrong by how much happiness they produce for all involved. What about justice? What differentiates justice from the rest of morality? Would utilitarianism allow people to act unjustly if they would promote more happiness overall? So looking at rights, violating legal rights or moral rights, violating what's deserved, breaking faith, being partial. A nice little diagram you're showing what people have a right to, what protects security, what we should compel people to do or avoid, and what produces happiness, justice, and morality. And finally, to look back at act versus rule utilitarianism, a distinction that didn't exist when Mill was writing. Act utilitarianism, moral value of acts judged by utility of consequences of those kinds of acts. Rule utilitarianism, moral value of acts judged by whether they follow rules. Rules judged by utility of their consequences, generally accepted and or followed. So we should judge what is morally right or wrong based on consequences, how much happiness is produced for the sentient beings involved, consider usual consequences for that act of kind, consider amount of happiness measured as pleasure. Rules of justice are crucial for human happiness. Yeah, so it's interesting because I think these modern theories of consciousness are largely utilitarianism in nature, and what we looked at, these mechanistic understandings for how consciousness, in possibly like the rules-based and the act-based utilitarianism, could look at when we looked at the bottom-up versus top-down principles. So I got this one last one in utilitarianism, and then we'll finish off with existentialism. And here, so we get further into act and rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism, assess each individual situation on its own merit with the aim of promoting the greatest happiness for those involved. In rule utilitarianism, people should follow and be guided by moral rules, which in the past have shown to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers. So some examinations of broad labels, Bentham and act utilitarianism, and Mill is a rule utilitarianism. However, such labels are cruel and have two major faults. The term act and rule utilitarianism are anachronistic when applied to Bentham and Mill. Robert Arrington has mentioned that such labels came into use after Bentham and Mill had died, and they do not do justice to the subtleties of Mill's philosophy, who many consider being more akin to weak rule utilitarianism. So nice little chart. on Bentham versus Mill. Bentham, principle of utility, emphasis on pleasure, concern with quantity of pleasure, social reformer, criminal, judicial, penal, labeled an act utilitarianism, versus Mill, greatest happiness principle, emphasis on happiness also, concerned with quality of pleasure, social reformer, equality for woman, labeled as a rule utilitarianism. So, problems with act utilitarianisms and the benefits of rule utilitarianism. So, consequences are hard to predict. So for act utilitarianism, no guidelines to help the individual when facing a moral decision other than the philosophic calculus, which many consider to be too impractical, unable to predict consequences accurately. Rule utilitarianism has the benefit of receiving guidance from past rules, which is shown to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, may predict consequences accurately. The consequences are difficult to predict, bounded, and perfect rationality. When explaining this weakness of act utilitarianism, examination is helpful to refer to the terms bounded and perfect rationality. Bounded rationality is when someone is unaware of the full facts. As Professor John Rawls stated, they are acting under a veil of ignorance. On the other hand, perfect rationality refers to the situation where all the facts are known. Act utilitarianism suffers from the drawback of bounded rationality more than rule utilitarianism, and it has no guidelines for which it may predict outcomes. So Peter Singer, act utilitarianism is self-defeating. Singer illustrates this problem with the example of promise keeping. Promises are made on the understanding that they will be kept, something the rule utilitarian recognizes as promoting happiness. However, while act utilitarianisms may make a promise in a particular situation, there can be no guarantee that the act utilitarianism will always uphold promise keeping, and so one can never take seriously a promise from act utilitarianism, and there's no confident theory, no confidence that they will keep their promises. So act utilitarianism, by definition, inconsistent philosophy. Act utilitarianism make decisions which promote the greatest pleasure for the greatest number for a particular situation without following any principle other than utility. But if everyone followed act utilitarianism, it would be impossible to predict consequences. So by definition, one could not will that everyone follow act utilitarianism, for if they did, the ethical theory would not work. Rule utilitarianism, however, recommend following rules which in the past have promoted happiness, so as their approach to ethics can be universally applied and consequences predicted, thus avoiding the inconsistency of act utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism does not take account of professional or contractual obligations. Society functions by people recognizing their obligation once they have signed a contract. And act utilitarianism, might report. So here the example of a doctor and following the code of a doctor. And what about act utilitarianism not taking into account family relations? Utilitarianism has been accused of undermining family relationships as it adopts an impartial approach to the overall happiness for the greatest number is all that matters. So Bentham's act utilitarianism states everybody is to count for one and nobody for more than one, an implication being that when it is your mom's birthday, it would be better to donate money to Oxfam than to buy her a present. Rule utilitarianism might imply that whilst the spirit of utilitarianism is to be impartial, past experience teaches that when preferential treatment is offered to those who are close, like family and friends, then those societies function well, producing the greatest happiness. What about utilitarianism undermining justice? You have instrumental approach. Utilitarianism think that justice is only important if it serves the principles of utility, saying that justice has no intrinsic value. So response, the long-term implication being that by upholding the rule of justice, people have confidence that they will not be found guilty of crimes they have not committed, even if a guilty verdict means that in the short term, the majority of people were happy. Based on the To Kill a Mockingbird example. So analyzing Mill's understanding of justice, justice is a name given to a certain moral requirements which regarded collectively stand higher in the scale of social utility and are therefore of more paramount obligation than any others. So in the true spirit of utilitarianism, Mill concedes that justice is not of intrinsic value, but is important due to the instrumental, consequential value it has for society by upholding principles which make for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Mill recognizes other goods besides happiness. Now it's palpable that they do desire things which in common language are decidedly distinguished from happiness. They desire, for example, virtue in the absence of vice, no less than pleasure in the absence of pain. Desire of virtue is not as universal, but it is as authentic a fact as the desire of happiness. Ingredients of happiness are various, and each of them is desirable in itself. Besides being a means, they're part of the end. Virtue, according to the utilitarian doctrine, is not naturally and originally part of the end, but is capable of becoming so. And in those who love it disinterestedly, it has become so, and it is desired and cherished, not as a means to happiness, but as part of the happiness. Ingredients of happiness are various, like virtues, integrity, honesty, courage, fortitude, prudence. So does this mean that Mill is not a strict utilitarian? So Mill is a clear believer in utilitarianism, but as he has previously been mentioned, following his nervous breakdown, Mill was greatly influenced by the writings of Aristotle, and understanding the ingredients of happiness are various, which include the importance of virtue. Are we seeing Aristotle's influence of virtue ethics at work? A case study, moral issues, current issues, Godzin, looking at, God forbid, the eggs of aborted fetuses. You'll compare the arguments of Pope John Paul II, and Roger Godson, the scientific researcher. Different utilitarianism virtue calculation. John Harris, example of the survival lottery. These famous thought experiments, euthanasia. Many famous thought experiments is to consider the implications of utilitarianism. Flip through some of the ones brought by this slideshow. So, pretty interesting. So that covers our overview of utilitarianism.
Up about like reducing the reduction of reality to certain kind of experiential.
You have some kind
of things.
Voice.
I can try. Yeah, my microphone's busted. Give me a moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going to go from here. Like, I wanted to round out my study of consciousness, and I thought this stuff was related, and especially if you heard like these long essays I was reading, The Most Modern Theories of the Brain as a Predictive Machine, and it's basically, it was good. I've been studying this for 20 years, basically my whole adult life. And when I went to university and first started taking science, that was like one of the things, like I really want to understand this consciousness thing. And then if you're looking at like the biology, I could be doing like a high school PowerPoint that is just going over the basics of biology, and then you're getting into extremely complicated, most modern day scientific research, where you have to really have a mastery of the highest forms of biology and even like electrical engineering to truly understand this stuff. So you took a long time to review the science, and like I think I have a background in science, but hopefully people who don't have a background in science, if they had some benefit from my videos, although as I said, like, I largely did this as my own private exercise to personally, I don't think that I want to get more back into this more, and so I'm going to go back and look at some existentialism. And I've read some of this. I'm not really an expert on these topics, but I thought that they're extremely related to these topics we've been discussing, and that's why I wanted to include them in this. And after this, I think I'm going to have one more on linguistics, and I'm going to read over a study of overview of all the most recent evidence of brain science. Probably do that tomorrow, and then next week I'll probably finish off. I'm going to do one on kind of like ancient theology in Hinduism, world history, maybe some Native American stuff, and one on the history of Christian theology, and then I'll see where I go from there. So largely this was my own personal desire to do this, largely for the sake of reviewing a lifetime of my own studies. Okay, so I'm not sure. It looks like I lost everyone. So let me go straight into existentialism. Okay, so let's look at this overview. Major existential philosophers. You got Kierkegaard, known as the father of existentialism, Denmark, believed that church congregations had no purpose, that Christendom was too political, and that Christianity was becoming an empty religion, stressed the importance of the individual, and is credited with creating the ideas of subjectivity and the leap of faith, wrote the concept of irony from the papers of One Still Living, Fear and Trembling, many others, influenced by Luther, Kant, and Socrates. Nietzsche, influenced by Dostoevsky, Emerson, Goethe, Kant, Plato, Pascal, Darwin, and Stendhal, wrote The Birth of Tragedy, Untimely Meditations on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, All Too Human, Beyond Good and Evil, associated with nihilism, the phrase God is dead, Will to Power, and the Übermensch. Nihilism, total rejection of established laws and institutions, anarchy, terrorism, and other revolutionary activities, total and absolute destructiveness, especially towards the world at large and including oneself. Philosophy, an extreme form of skepticism, the denial of all real existence or the objective basis for truth, nothingness or non-existence. Jean-Paul Sartre, born in 1905, believed that ideas are the result of real-life situations and experience, embraced communism and opposed the Vietnam War, wrote Being and Nothingness, Existentialism is a Humanism, The Flies, No Exit, The Road to Freedom. Influenced by Kant, Nietzsche, Marx, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Flaubert. So Albert Camus, often associated with existentialism, but personally denied the label, opposed the philosophy of nihilism, claimed that while he did not believe in God, he was not an atheist. A human rights activist in the 50s, strongly opposed capital punishments, wrote The Stranger, Myth of Sisyphus, The Plague and the Fall, won the Nobel Prize in 1957, examined dualism such as happiness and sadness, dark and light, life and death, in order to euphanize mortality. Influenced by Marx, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Kierkegaard, Melville, Nietzsche, Sartre, Hugo, and Orwell. Absurdism, philosophy stating that the effects of humanity to find meaning in the universe ultimately fail and are hence absurd because no such meaning exists, at least in relation to the individual. As being searched for meaning in a meaningless world, humans have three ways of resolving the dilemma: suicide, escaping existence, religious beliefs in a transcendent world, or accepting the absurd. And okay, so nice overview of what we're going to be talking about. So let's jump right in. Short one. Okay, so we're going to be talking about some Nietzsche. So Nietzsche has got this concept of master morality versus slave morality. So Nietzsche calls for a re-evaluation of values and a new type of philosopher and commander. The image of such leaders hovers before our eyes. whose new pressure and hammer will steel a conscious and transform a heart into bronze. Do you know this, you free spirits? So Nietzsche distinguishes between two historical forms of morality, master and slave, and clearly prefers the master morality and refers to the total degeneration of humanity. So master morality is like the classical Greek virtue ethics, an ideal of human excellence. The slave morality is like utilitarianism, egalitarianism, ideal happiness, ease, content, peace, rest, safety. So the master is like the Übermensch, the aristocracy, as opposed to the slave democracy. Master, the idea of good and bad applying to people, as opposed to the slave mentality, good or evil applying to actions. And the master believes that power is good, male dominant, slave power is bad, female dominant. Life itself is essentially a process of appropriating, injuring, overpowering the alien and the weaker, oppressing, being harsh, imposing your own form, incorporating, and at least the very least exploiting. Nietzsche apparently read Darwin, thought human species highly variable on verge of speciation. Master and slave moralities are not descriptions of actual morals of people, races, or states, but abstract types in Nietzsche's historical analysis of morality. You sometimes find them sharply juxtaposed inside the same person, even within a single soul. So that was so evolution teaches that two human beings as social animals evolved two conflicting drives, interspecies competition, which could be master morality. Most evolutionary competition is between members of the same species, and they have intra-species cooperation, the slave morality, interspecies advantage gained by altruism within a species. It's a nice preview of Nietzsche, some of what we're going to be getting into. Doesn't look like Babylon Hebrew is coming back real quick. So imagining and thinking. This is also on Nietzsche. So look at Sophie's Choice and Halley's description of the people of Le Chambron. Enable a reader or viewer to imagine persons acting in a way that might be described as evil or as good without knowing the motives of their action. Unpremeditated impulse or a long-established habit could be the motive in these cases. This is a famous example. Both cases, Sophie's Choice and Le Chambon, the results that viewers or readers see as bad, Sophie's suffering, her daughter's death, or as good, innocent people saved from death by strangers. The Nietzschean expert on Beyond Good and Evil invites thinking about possible motives for action in different moral frameworks. Nietzsche proposes an either-or standard beyond good and evil, challenging modern ideas about good and evil based on equality with good or bad based on difference. So Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche's diagnosis of modern cultural illness. Passive nihilism combines a failure to act, knowledge that there is a loss of belief in an absolute source of morality beyond culture or individuals, with the assumption that what is in the interest of the weakest is right, when in reality this belief destroys the strong and degrades culture because all people are not of equal value. So Nietzsche's Cure, distinction between noble and slave morality, critique of man of resentment, reactive versus active, argument for culture based on distinctions of rank in which nobles act out of reverence for tradition and self-confidence in their goodness. Such culture values contest and conflict versus aiming at the welfare for all. So you get morality as self versus other. Many forms of morality assume self-love or acting from self-interest is natural, yet most assume that morality sets limits on the extent to which self-love or self-interest are permitted as the only motive for action. Consequential theories see promoting the good of all as also in one's self-interest. Deontological theories about acting for a right principle, doing right because it is right, as an expression of rationality and dignity, while also benefiting others. Virtue theory sees virtuous action as contributing to good character and ultimately to happy life in the long term. And persons of exceptional virtue act as examples for others. So morality is self versus other. Further, So Nietzsche's noble acts spontaneously in order to release energy and or out of a sense of competition for honor. While the effect of their acts on others may be cruel, the result is to create higher culture with standards and differences in rank. Nietzsche's slave acts out of resentment for suffering inflicted on them by nobles based on an inverted sense of values. What is seen as good by nobles is evil to slaves. Their aim is to obtain revenge, undermine noble values, and to substitute reactive, passive values for active, spontaneous values. According to Nietzsche, this creates a decadent, weak culture. So the master-slave morality, master determines his own values in relation to himself. He creates values. The will to power is the central concept. This power is firstly power over himself. The slave determines his values in opposition to those of the master. That is, values that are determined from outside. Those values that alleviate the existence of sufferers come to the forefront. Slave morality is the morality of utility. So you have good and bad versus good and evil. Good and bad is the distinction made by the aristocrat. For the aristocrat, the enemy is a man whose character has nothing to despise and much to honor. The image, the beast of prey, the magnificent blonde brute, avidly rampant for the spoils of victory. So good and evil is the slave distinction. Unable to act on their own behalf, the slave finds their outlet in imaginary revenge, resentment. They say no to what is outside of them. That is, they define themselves in terms of others rather than themselves. This no is their creative deed. For the slave, evil equals the good of the man of the opposite morality. So the creativity of the aristocrat barbarian. Nietzsche equates the aristocrat with the barbarian, trying to say, what's the value of ferocity, unbroken strength of will, and desire for power? The noble caste has always been the barbarian caste, more complete men. All that is new is evil. Why does he say that? So Nietzsche, the herd morality, slave morality, altruism, I'm not worth much, Christian version, better to feel a sinner than nothing at all, revenge and resentment as a means of enduring life. For Nietzsche, the socialist cry for rights and justice only shows that he is oppressed by his inadequate culture. So Nietzsche's critique of morality is life-denying. According to Nietzsche, peace and universal equality are life-denying principles. Life is precisely will to power. Against Marx, exploitation is not primitive or depraved. It's a primary organic function. Will to power equals the will to life. So Nietzsche's critique of Judaism and Christianity. For Nietzsche, they are the moralities of paltry people. On one hand, the law forbids actions, not the attitudes of mind. On the other, the moral idealist requires the attitude of mind be forbidden also. Nature is expelled from morality when it is said, love your enemies. By protecting the weak and infirm, these religions work against the evolutionary struggle for survival of the fittest. The critique of moral philosophers ask, what does man desire? If they start with the question, they can only answer happiness. And they answer that to acquire happiness, we need virtue. Why do they answer in this way? Because this is the most rational approach. Nietzsche claims we do not desire happiness, we desire power. Pleasure is a sensation of power. Nietzsche says the history of philosophy is a story of secret and made hatred of all the prerequisites of life. According to Nietzsche, cruelty and culture. According to Nietzsche, what values will stand up against the brute facts of existence? Cruelty and deception, as we call high culture, is based on the spiritualizing and intensifying of cruelty. The wild beast has not been slain at all. In every desire for knowledge, there is a drop of cruelty, or why suffering can only be fully appreciated by the aristocrat. So Nietzsche's transvaluation of value to translate man back into nature questions, is one to act spontaneously or react to a stimuli? Is one's problems oneself, or is one a solution already? Is one to be perfect through smallness, or the task, or imperfect through the extraordinary character of the aim? Nietzsche, it always comes down to power. Okay, another nice overview of Nietzsche. So enjoying this philosophy here. Let's So Kierkegaard, during the Second World War, when Europe found itself in a crisis faced with death and destruction, that the existential movement began to flourish, popularized in France in the 1940s. The big ideas of existentialism, despite encompassing a huge range of philosophical, religious, and political ideologies, the underlying concepts of existentialism are simple. Existence precedes essence. So existentialism, the title of a set of philosophical ideas that emphasize the existence of the human being, the lack of meaning and purpose in life, and the solitude of human existence. Existence precedes essence, implies that the human being has no essence, no essential self. So essence, general components that exist before a thing does, created to serve the purpose of creator. The example, a carpenter wants to build a bed. He knows the essence, like the wood, frames, legs of a bed before the concrete bed exists. It must exist in his mind first. Quick schemata, similar to Kabbalistic thoughts. Object, human subjects. In the world of objects, the essence comes first. In the world of human subjects, it is different. Man is the only being that has intelligence to conceive an essence. A man exists physically before any consciousness of himself. He can only form this essence of himself after he exists. So existence precedes essence, hence the name existentialism. There is no or pre-existing conditions that guide or determine man's behavior or essence, leads to the absurd condition man seeks meaning in a meaningless world, universe unconscious of our existence. Man is condemned to be free, leads to modern despair from man's overwhelming sense of responsibility and recognition of his fundamental aloneness in an indifferent universe. The artist existentialist achieves meaningful happiness by facing the pain and still affirming life. Choice and commitment. Humans have freedom to choose. Each individual makes choices that create his or her own nature. Because we choose, we must accept risk and responsibility for wherever our commitments take us. Jean-Paul Sartre, a human being is absolutely free and absolutely responsible. Anguish is the result. So we mentioned Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir. All existentials are concerned with the study of being or ontology. To an extent, an existentialist believes that a person's life is nothing but the sum of the life he has shaped for himself. At every moment, it is always his own free will choosing how to act. He is responsible for his actions, which limit future actions. Thus, he must create a morality in the absence of any known predetermined absolute values. God does not figure into the equation, because even if God does exist, he does not reveal to men the meaning of their lives. Honesty with oneself is the most important value. Every decision must be weighed in light of all the consequences of that action. Life is absurd, but we engage it. So human subjectivity, it's impossible to transcend human subjectivity. Human existence cannot be captured by reason or objectivity. It must include passion, emotion, and the subjective. Each of us is responsible for everything and to every human being. This is Simone de Beauvoir. Subjectivity versus objectivity. And so in reason, subjectivity refers to the property of perceptions, arguments, and language as being based on the subject's point of view and hence influenced in accordance with a particular bias. Objectivity, subjectivity's opposite properties of objectivity, which refers to such as based in a separate, distance, and unbiased point of view, such that concepts discussed are treated as objects. So in philosophy, subjectivity refers to specific discerning interpretations of any aspect of experience that are unique to the person experiencing them, the quality that are only available to that person's consciousness. Though the causes of experience are thought to be objective and available to everyone, experience themselves are only available to the person experiencing them. Philosophy, an objective fact, means the truth that remains true everywhere, independent of human thought and feelings, like 2 + 2 = 4. Subjective fact is a truth that is only true in certain times and places or people. So dread and anxiety. Dread is feeling of general apprehension. Kierkegaard interpreted it as God's way of calling each individual to make a commitment to a personally valid way of life. Anxiety stems from our understanding and recognition of the total freedom of choice that confronts us every moment and the individual's confrontation with nothingness. Responsibility, but accepting such total responsibility entails a profound alteration of my attitude towards life, sharing in the awesome business of determining the future development of humanity, generally through the particular decisions I make for myself, produces an overwhelming sense of anguish. Moreover, since there is no external authority to which I can turn in an effort to escape my duty. In this regard, I am bound to feel abandonment as well. Finally, since I repeatedly experience evidence that my own powers are inadequate to the task, I am driven to despair. There can be no relief, no help, no hope. Human life demands total commitment to a path whose significance will always remain open to doubt. So Second Empire, architectural style was popular in Victoria era, reaching the zenith between 1865 and 80. It's called French, related to Sartre. Bad faith, when individuals negate their true nature in an attempt to become self they are not. Classic example is Sartre's waiter, who is always just slightly too friendly, too helpful, too willing to play the part of a waiter rather than being the less friendly, helpful, and waiter-like self he would be if he were not assuming the identity of waiter. In assuming the role of waiter, Sartre's character has negated himself by denying his authentic ego, with all his characteristics not becoming of a waiter. So in social situations, we play a part that is not ourselves. If we passively become that part, we are thereby avoiding the important decisions and choices by which personality should be formed. When the picture of a man has of himself is provided by those who see him in the distorted image of himself that they give back to him, he has rejected what the philosopher has called reality. He has, moreover, rejected the possibility of projecting himself into his future and existing in the fullest sense. The mere appearance of another person causes one to look at him or herself as an object and to see his or her world as it appears to the other. This is not done from a specific location outside the self. It is a non-positional. This is a recognition of the subjectivity in others. Sartre describes being alone in a park. At this time, all relations in the park are available, accessible, and occurring for him. When another person arrives in the park, there is now a relation between that person and the bench, and this is not entirely available to him. The relation is presented as an object, but is really not an object. It cannot be known. It flees from him. The other person is a drain hole in the world. They disintegrate the relation of which Sartre was earlier the absolute center. So another Sartre's example involves a young woman on a first date. She ignores the obvious sexual implication of her date's compliments to her physical appearance, but accepts them instead as words directed at her as a human consciousness. As he takes her hand, she lets it rest indifferently in his, refusing either to return the gesture or to rebuke it. Thus, she delays the moment when she must choose to either acknowledge or reject his advances or submit to them. She conveniently considers her hand only as a thing in the world, and his compliments as unrelated to her body, playing on her dual human reality as a physical being and as a conscious, separate, and free from this physicality. So there's also a key aspect of living in bad faith to allow others to define or help define our choices ourselves. So am I a good person or hard worker? Some subjective aspects of self, like are we good looking, smart, funny, morality and ethics. One of the most important implications of bad faith is the abolition of traditional ethics and morality, because being a moral person requires one to deny authentic impulses and change one's actions based on the will of a person other than oneself. Being a moral person is one of the most severe forms of bad faith. So Lewis Leiter, cogent argument for existentialism, the country doctor, Kafka. Country doctor comments on man who, buffeted by the scheme of things, is unable to transcend the part assigned to him by the absurdity of that existence, because he does not lack conscious knowledge of his condition, but refuses to act in the face of his pretentious freedom. The doctor, an archetype of the anti-existential hero, deserves his fate, lacking the human stuff necessary to create and structure situations. He permits himself to be manipulated by the groom, the family, and the horses, but he becomes, by submitting, a tool within the situations they create. Never consciously does he attempt through an overt act until too late to establish his own essence, to rise above any manipulated value he possesses from others. As a doctor, he is a thing, an object, a tool. As a man, he is nothing. So Nietzsche and nihilism. Every belief, considering something true is necessarily false, because there is simply no true world. Nihilism is not the only belief, not only the belief that everything deserves to perish, but one actually puts one's shoulder to the plow one destroys. For some time now, our whole European culture has been moving towards catastrophe, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, restlessly, violently headlong like a river that wants to preach the end. Compared to Macbeth, so absurdism, belief nothing can explain or rationalize human existence. There is no answer to why am I. Humans exist in a meaningless, irrational universe, and any search for order will bring them into direct conflict with this universe. Like The Stranger, Conrad, I think, or Kafka's The Trial. You will never be happy if you continue to search for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you are looking for the meaningful meaning of life. It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. The nothingness and death. Death hangs all over us. Our awareness of it can bring freedom or anguish. I am my own existence. Nothing structures my world. Nothingness in our inherent lack of self. We are in constant pursuit of self. Nothingness is the creative wellspring from which all human possibilities can be realized. Alienation and estrangement from other humans, from institutions, from the past, from the future. We only exist right now, right here. Albert Camus dissociated himself from the existentialist, but acknowledged man's lonely condition in the universe. Is man of the absurd, rejects despair, and commits himself to the anguish and responsibility of living as best he can. Basically, man creates himself through the choices he makes. There are no guides for these choices, but he has to make them anyways, which renders life absurd. So the absurd world, conspicuous in its lack of logic, consistency, coherence, intelligibility, and realism. The literature of the absurd depicts the anguish, forlornness, and despair inherent in the human condition. Counter to the rationalist assumptions of traditional humanism, absurdism denies the existence of universal truth or value. Nice flowchart. Because we have consciousness, we feel that life is meaningful, but we know that the universe as a whole has no meaning, so our lives are a contradiction. To live well, we need to overcome this contradiction. We can do this by fully embracing the meaninglessness of existence. Life will be lived better, all the better, if it has no meaning. So Camus's absurd world, the world of values is never predictable nor controllable. A gap exists between man's intellectual constructs, meaning in the universe, the reality. We cannot justify new values by appeals to convention. Relation to Sartre, conditions, social contracts, isolating him from the world in a way that cats and stones are not isolated. Human beings for itself. To Moorsalt, does not analyze himself. No thoughts or concerns were past or future. Future cannot be predicted or planned for. This life is as good as any. The world is absurd, and planning for it is pointless. Regret, guilt, and remorse do not analyze himself. They are based on values outside of your own. They are for others. Can you feel regret without thinking of others? These feelings distract from the moment. So afterlife, God, and spirituality. Does not bother to imagine afterlife or God. Focus on this life. Spirituality is supposed to add something to this world. It's the relation of Moorsalt to Sartre. Conditions, social constructs, isolate him from the world in a way that cats and stones are not isolated. Alienation. So a few existential riddles. Okay. So let's keep it going. Let's look at Kierkegaard. Existentialism, Kierkegaard. Existentialism refers to any philosophy that asserts that the most important philosophical matters involve fundamental questions of meaning and choice as they affect active individuals. Existentialists point out that objective science and rationalistic philosophy cannot come to grips with the real problem of human existence. Existentialists believe that general answers, grand metaphysical systems, and objective theories cannot address the concrete concerns of living individuals. So Kierkegaard, his works were virtually ignored during his lifetime, partly because he wrote in Danish, partly because of what he wrote, and partly because of his brilliant use of sarcasm and irony. Kierkegaard rebelled against both the system and objectivity, so his works confounded easy classification. His unscientific and unsystematic attacks on conventional Christian theology and dogma, on science and professional philosophy, took the form of satirical essays, parables, anecdotes, and real and fictional journals. Kierkegaard saw himself as a disciple of Socrates, and like Socrates, Kierkegaard's life and work make a seamless whole. Kierkegaard thought he had a family curse. Kierkegaard went to the University of Copenhagen, 1830, studied theology, and then spent the next 10 years drinking and attending the theater. Just before his father died, he returned to theology, passing the exam of honors in 1840. At the age of 27, Kierkegaard fell in love with a 14-year-old girl, Regina Olsen, and the two of them became engaged when she turned 17. Kierkegaard quickly broke off the engagement, but struggled the rest of his life to explain why. One possibility is the conformity marriage suggests. In 1843, a week after his sacrifice of Regina, he fled to Berlin, writing Either or, Fragment of Life, his first important work, and Repetition, an essay on experimental psychology, through which he hoped to reconnect with her. Kierkegaard interpreted the story of Isaac being returned to Abraham to mean that if you give up something for God, you get it back plus the love and salvation of God. Applying this universal formula to himself, he reasoned that if he gave up Regina to devote himself to God, he would get both. So as a Christian struggling with existential predicament of choice and commitment, Kierkegaard grew increasingly interested in what it meant to be a Christian. He became convinced that the institutionalized Christianity suffers the same inauthenticity as the other institutions. Inauthenticity results when the nature and needs of the individual are ignored, denied, or obscured, or made less important than institutions, abstractions, or groups. Authenticity is the subjective condition of an individual living honestly and courageously in the moment, without refuge in excuses or reliance on groups or institutions for meaning and purpose. Individual, 1855, Kierkegaard visited his banker brother-in-law to withdraw the last of his money. Going home, he fell to the street, paralyzed from the waist down. Destitute, helpless, and weak, Kierkegaard died a month later at the age of 42 and was buried in a huge cathedral church of Copenhagen. Most interesting epithet for Kierkegaard is found in his own words. The martyrdom this author suffered may be briefly described thus: he suffered from being a genius in a provincial town. The standard he applied was on the average too great for his contemporaries, yet he himself was that individual if no one else was, and became that more and more. Truth and subjectivity, major existential issue. How am I to exist? Kierkegaard pointed out any choice once made rules out all other possibilities. Basic fact of Kierkegaard's project, he referred to his existentialism, the dilemma of lived choices. Must find a truth for me, find the idea for which he can live and die. Kierkegaard, no amount of objective abstract knowledge could ever provide meaning to life. Truth is a subjective condition, not an objective one. Kierkegaard rejects any descriptive or systematic approach to dealing with that individual. Objectivity as on truth. For the most part, philosophers have agreed that arguments should be elevated rationally and objectively, but Kierkegaard vehemently disagreed, considering objectivity and impartiality to be dangerous delusions. Not only is impartiality impossible, but claims of objectivity and disinterestedness are always lies, preferring objective impartiality to subjective involvement itself a bias. Favoring objectivity is a form of partiality. Subjectivity is on truth. Moreover, reason is a mere abstraction, noble sounding term that conceals an individual's subjective choice. To complicate matters even more, the impersonal quality of objective language reduces the uniqueness of individual existence to mere generalizations, abstractions, and features held in common. What is individual is not described. So the present age, Kierkegaard lamented when he termed the massing of society, contemporary society, the crowd overwhelms the individual, yet the individual feels lost without the crowd. Modern people are anonymous creatures who depend upon experts to point the way towards salvation. Rather than being themselves, modern people simply conform to an abstract type. Modern people are reduced to numerical equal at the expense of their own authenticity. Becoming a subject for Kierkegaard, an individual exists specifically as a Christian when the individual appropriates his or her belief by taking up subjectivity. There is a qualitative difference between what we often call the existence and what Kierkegaard means by truly existing. To act is not merely to behave, but to assent with one's whole being, even though one lacks sufficient objective information. So stages of life's ways. According to Kierkegaard, without God, a man is never essentially himself, which one is only by being before God, and therefore never satisfied with being himself. Kierkegaard offers a series of sketches and descriptions of a dialectic process that involves what Cooper calls imitations and self-reflective kind that indicate, however incoherently, something about themselves. Kierkegaard refers to stages on life's ways are three explicit ways of choosing to live: the aesthetic stage, ethical stage, and religious stage. The aesthetic stage is a futile fight against boredom, characterized by the pursuit of pleasure, especially sensuous pleasure. Its lowest of Kierkegaard's three stages life considers it immoral, exemplified by Don Juan. Aesthetic is primarily concerned with individual experience and individual sensory experience in particular. An aesthetic experience could range from animalistic lust to deep appreciation of music, but it always relates to the single individual to something else. An ethical stage, second of Kierkegaard's stages, the ethical stage is a way of life that involves making commitments to the norms of customs in society, devoted to the general universal principles that are continually revised according to changing humanistic values. One acts for the betterment of others rather than for oneself. Ethical stage is securely moral and exemplified by Kantian ethics. So something higher than ethics, Hegel considered the ethical to be the highest form of life, and Kierkegaard agrees that it is the highest that can be understood. However, Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembles argues there is a third category, that of the religious, and that the religious is higher than the ethical. So for Kierkegaard, the religious stage of life is the highest, is the only authentic way of living. Only the religious life acknowledges our dual nature and provides a way for the individual to transform the particular into a universal. The ethical, it can only be achieved by a leap of faith exemplified by Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac. From any perspective but that of faith, what Abraham did was absurd. Only faith allows us to be authentic, existing selves. Okay. So nice review of Kierkegaard. Okay, so got four more here. So do one more. Nietzsche, The Battle of God versus Superman. Nietzsche came from a long line of Lutheran ministers, studied classics, became a brilliant professor, left university, lived in solitude and write. Mid-40s, Nietzsche began his lifelong battle with mental illness. 1890, became internationally known, although he knew nothing of success. In 1956, Nietzsche died in an insane asylum. His lifelong goal, he was committed to teaching us how to live life to its fullest, which he thought could be best done in a godless, meaningless world. So the horizon, from the use and abuse of history. Every society has a moral horizon. These are absolute statements about how we should live, inform citizens what is morally right and wrong. Great men create horizons for us. Plato, Locke, Hegel, Buddha, Jefferson, Jesus, they all believe they discovered, not created, truths. Best civilizations, the moral horizon, allowed the weak, the incompetent, and the stupid to be eliminated through natural process, like survival is the fittest. Morals like Jesus said these values are wrong, that laws should protect the weak. So the consequences of Christianity's moral horizon, this code became dominant moral horizon in Europe. Christianity triumphed over Rome. Today, Christian morals go unquestioned and unchallenged by most of us. So the process of condemning, strengthening, encouraging a welfare state has been accomplished by convincing society that the new Christian moral code is the perfect, absolute, divine code of the universe. Society now unquestionably accepts Christian morality as a transcendent moral horizon. The consequent natural leaders, the confident, the courageous, the innovators are shackled by a value system that makes them equal with the masses. These horizons are only perspective. For Nietzsche, all horizons, including Christianity, are man-made perspectives in constant flux, not absolute truths. All horizons are created by men. There is no truth outside man and society. Life has no meaning before we give it meaning. Each our mistakes is perfect and absolute. Each our mistaken is perfect and absolute. There are many possible perspectives one can take on any moral issue. Every perspective is limiting and incomplete. And since moral horizons are only illusions, since there are no transcendental ethics or values for us to use, we must create our own. since all these horizons are coming to us from within this world, once we realize that we are the creators of human values, we are free to choose whatever values are best, and surely we will choose the value system that has led us to greatness before Christianity, the natural process of weeding out the weak and empowering great men to do great things. So, more on Nietzsche's slave versus master morality. For Nietzsche, Christianity replaced the master morality with slave morality. The slave morality of Christianity, being careful and sensitive to all, place others first, don't be selfish, be meek, help the less fortunate, sacrifice. For this is how a good slave is to act. Slave morality imposes his will on the strong. Don't be strong, assertive, aggressive, selfish. Work in the service of others, not yourself. Those who do not are going to hell and are evil. Nietzsche wanted us to go back to a form of the old master morality, the master morality of Nietzsche. To be great, we must break away from false thinking. This thinking prevents men from being great individuals. Christianity creates mediocrity, shackles great men to the mundane average. Master morality would encourage us to be unequal warriors and to rise above the weak, stupid, and meek. Let the strong rise to the top of the heap. So Nietzsche basically hates Christianity. It is a social construct, but the masses blindly follow it as if it were truth, forces men to following the teachings of God, not their greater and more powerful instinct, the will of power. Under threat, fear forces men to value humility, not pride, equality, not individualism, timidity, not aggression, and others, not yourself. Nietzsche also hates democracy, socialism, and communism, that idiots run the system, are based on equality, even though we are not all equal. The masses of weak always win out, while the few strong thinkers are forced to comply. Turning good into evil, Christianity's moral inversion. Christianity turned the old category of good and bad on its head by replacing it with good and evil. Before Christianity, following our natural instinct to be great was good, suppressing it was bad. There was no concept of evil associated with nature. After Christianity, our instinct to become great became evil. The slave morality, suppressing it, became good. Now our nature is inherently evil. The Romans and pre-Socratic Greeks followed their natural instinct. Good was strong, assertive, individualistic, bold, powerful, and vigorous. Bad was weak, timid, sacrificial, and passive. Primary focus was on striving for good. Christianity forces us to deny our natural instinct and view it as evil. Good is the meek, timid, sacrificial, passive, nurturing. Evil is strong, assertive, individualistic, bold, powerful, and vigorous. The primary focus is on fighting evil, the old Roman notion of good. So in the end, Christianity turns our human drive into an evil desire. This leads man to hate himself and battle against himself. This leads all society to suffer, for man can no longer strive for individual greatness and boldness without overwhelming guilt and fear of hell. The wasted possibilities. Think how much greatness and human potential has been lost and squandered over the centuries. Claiming that billions of people have done nothing because of the foolish Christian mentality that told them to serve others for their reward is in heaven. God and his morality must die if things are going to change and man is to be free for him to will to power. It's the death of God, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche hated what Christianity had done to the world, zapped out his greatness. Nietzsche was an open atheist, first politically right atheist, believed that God would die. God dies when men realize they created God, not vice versa. And with God's death also comes the death of universal ideas and truths. How God dies, Christianity makes us strive for perfection to relieve guilt. Thus we use science to obtain order and perfection. Our science kills God in our belief in absolutes. Science explains everything from creation to the Big Bang. So last man, after God's death, there will be crisis. Without false horizons, most will be lost. Most, the weak, need this illusion of stability, existentialism, and suicide. So the last man in the herd in the crisis is a despicable coward. He knows that there is no moral truth, but is afraid to live authentically and think of himself. Even though he should feel liberated, he repeats the same mistakes and refuses to give up the old oppressive code. So Superman and his will to power, the death of God will liberate others. For some, God's death is a glass half full. It is a great opportunity to do great things. A godless, meaningless world is freedom. Life becomes a blank page for us to write our own life story, not a coloring book in which we have to stay in the lines. God's death gives liberation from guilt, allows us to be creative, to construct one's own horizon, to follow our own will to power. So what is our will to power? For Nietzsche, it is a man's eternal drive for greatness and creativity. For centuries, it has been suppressed by Christianity. It is the voice in our heart that tells us to strive and rise above the masses. not to take care of them and to master everything. So the Superman, what is a Superman? Part poet, part philosopher, part saint. He's the one that sees possibilities in the lost horizon, may even need to be cruel and disconnected, follows will of power and is free for the first time. Not all Supermen are alike. They must be true to themselves, each taking a different path. Break away from society, don't lead. To lead forces you to take care of others again, risk making yourselves into a new god, may stifle others from being their own Supermen. But what should a Superman do? Nietzsche was purposely vague. If he told us we would follow him, not our own will. So the danger in Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote some dangerous things, mentioned withdrawal from society and public responsibility, invites the apocalypse, the war of the herd, advocates eugenics, selective breeding, tells us not to care for others, the abuse of his writings by Hitler, Nietzsche's link with fascism. So, closing, Nietzsche just giving us another truth. He's giving us his perspective, not truth, but his is the best yet for understanding perspectives. Nietzsche gives us radical new ideas, perspectivism, all social truth is subjective, arguing against the ideas of benevolence, brotherhood, charity, and pity, arguing for the good of Christian evil, the excitement and freedom of a meaningless world. Most importantly, Nietzsche reminds us to seize the day. Most of our lives are spent doing nothing. We wake up, go to work, go to bed, follow the will of power, think outside the social box. Don't be part of the herd, make a mark on history. And so Shakespeare's Richard III, conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised to first keep the strong in awe. Our strong arms be conscious, swords are law. Okay, so got two more. So you got three more here. So let's look at Jean-Paul Sartre and his existentialism. So it's existentialism, opposition to rationalist tradition, belief that radical freedom is a condition of human existence rather than a characteristic of human nature. Who we are is the function of the choices we make, not the other way around. We must commit ourselves at every moment. Concept of authenticity, defined as living according to the choices made consciously in responsibility. There's no universal principles. Anti-rationalist stance, social order is a fabrication that allows us to avoid our isolation. Responsibility for my choices is mine alone. So Sartre is an atheistic existentialist. What consequences does not believing in God have for the existentialist? Existence precedes essence. We are born and then make ourselves through our choices. As we choose for ourselves, we choose for all humankind. So anguish of forlornness. The existential feels this is because without the existence of God, we're alone. So anguish, unable to escape a deep sense of responsibility. It is always for me to decide that this is the angel's voice. I'm not Abraham, yet I must perform exemplary acts at every moment. Sacrifice of Isaac. Forlornness, God does not exist, and we must face all the consequences. What is this distress? Why does this distress the existentialist? Because finding values in the heaven of ideas disappears. If existence precedes essence, we cannot fall back on fixed and given human nature. There are no excuses. Man is condemned to be free. Why condemned? Why free? What is Sartre's view of failing to act? Man is nothing else than his plan. What can we count on? That which is in our power. There are no excuses outside of ourselves. Love equals a person's being in love. Genius is nothing other than that expressed in work and arts. Culture and freedom. Some say we are determined by our culture. Sartre says man is free to determine his existence in relation to the culture. Culture is a condition, not a characteristic. There is universality in man, but it is not given. It is being perpetually made. So I build the universe in choosing myself. So two kinds of humanism. Man is an end and a higher value. Value is assigned in relation to the best that certain men have done. Sartre's critique, man isn't an end because he is always in the making. Man is losing himself outside of himself, pursuing goals outside of himself. Sartre believes that existentialism is optimistic, a doctrine of action. So man is not a thing. Even the worst conditions do not render a man inhuman. Everything that happens to me is mine. To decide to be non-human is still my decision. Okay. And one last slide on Nietzsche. You want to really get this down. Nietzsche saw himself as the first to recognize the symptoms of profound sickness at the core of modernity. Modernity refers to the historical period of the 19th and 20th century nation states into a corresponding set of cultural conditions and beliefs dominated by Enlightenment ideas. Modernity includes faith in science, objective truth and rationality, expectations of inevitable progress, capitalism, urbanization, large-scale industrial enterprise, mass literacy, media, culture, political democracy, and secularization. So modernity and God. Nietzsche saw himself as the first to recognize the symptoms of a profound sickness at the core of modernity. His most famous or infamous pronouncement that God is dead is part of his assessment of the decadent condition of the modern age. So the outsider, perhaps no philosopher of modern times, has provoked as much controversy as Nietzsche. One of a handful of philosophers who can be called the best-selling authors, Nietzsche's work has a confrontational style that is both exhilarating and disturbing. Nietzsche was born, he is Prussian, further biography. So introduction to philology, Nietzsche left Bonn and enrolled in Leipzig. There he had a good fortune to meet Professor Ritschl, who recognized Nietzsche as a brilliant scholar. Ritschl kindled in him a passion for philology, the study of classical philosophy and literature. However, despite his academic success, he had become a lonely man. So Schopenhauer's pessimism. Well, in this state, he came across the work of Nietzsche, came across Schopenhauer, who argued that life was nothing more than a constant will to survive, known as pessimism, the belief that life is disappointing and their only hope is through detachment and withdrawal. Schopenhauer's philosophy found an enthusiastic audience in Nietzsche, who said, "Here was a mirror in which the world, life, my own mind were reflected in fearful grandeur." So beyond the academy, paradoxically, Schopenhauer's pessimism invigorated Nietzsche. In 1968, Ritschl recommended him for a chair of classical philology. Nietzsche was only 24, but the University hurriedly conferred the doctorate upon him, and he was appointed professor. Despite noble intentions, he was not particularly effective lecturer, and fewer students attended. He did not socialize well, and the academic routine drained him. Just 10 years later, he resigned, citing ill health, and was granted a pension. This enabled Nietzsche to break free from the confines of academic scholarship. Greatest work was accomplished in the 10-year period following his retirement from teaching at age 34. Tragic optimism. Around 1870, Nietzsche becomes intrigued with Darwinism and, using the idea of evolution, transformed Schopenhauer's pessimism into his own unique doctrine of overcoming. Now thinking of retreat and renunciation as weak-willed and decadent, he came to believe that the solution was tragic optimism, a sense of joy and vitality of someone who neither shrinks from struggle nor struggles blindly. Such a person overcomes pessimism without retreating into lies about ultimate meaning and purpose. The tragic optimist imposes meaning of a meaningless universe and overcomes his or her own innate fears and weaknesses. So Zarathustra speaks, Nietzsche came to see himself as the prophet of a healthier morality, so far beyond conventional values that required a revelation of all values. He spoke of doing philosophy with a hammer, tapping on the great idols to see which are hollow and then smashing them to bits. After a relationship with a young intellectual named Lou Salame, who later abandoned, Nietzsche retreated to the Swiss Alps, where he produced his most famous work, thus post Zarathustra, using the name of the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster. Zarathustra is at once a great destroyer of false values and a creator of new and healthy values, announcing the next evolutionary type, the Übermensch. So truth and perspective. Nietzsche followed Zarathustra with what many consider the two most coherent statements of his philosophy, beyond good and evil and towards the genealogy of morals. In them, Nietzsche's purpose is clear: to destroy conventional morality and replace it with a higher moral ideal. The Nietzschean perspective, Nietzsche's controversial status as a philosopher is due in part to the aphoristic style of these works, and in part to a form of relativism known as perspectivism. Nietzsche's perspectivism is the contention that every view is only one among many possible interpretations, including that of Nietzschean perspectivism. So Nietzsche adopts points of view, which he refers to as experiments, to prevent the reader from forgetting that they too have points of view. Attacks on objectivity. Based on modern philosophy, Nietzsche can be considered an anti-philosopher, a radical critic of foundational doctrines, who rejects the absolute authority of reason. So the anti-philosopher rejects possibility of a neutral stance on perspectiveless perspective. Instead of philosophical argument, then Nietzsche offers an appeal to aesthetic sensibilities to justify life as an aesthetic phenomenon, what he calls will to power. If I have no chance of discovering objective truth, we will have to invent truths according to our individual needs. Truth then is seen as a function of physiology of the individual rather than an objective fact derived from reason. So the will to power, call it what you wish, objectivity, truth, or wisdom. Nietzsche says that the single goal of science, religion, and philosophy is the exertion of power. It is mendacious for anyone to think of themselves as disinterested spectators capable of objective judgment. Nietzsche equates such will to truth as the will to power. Nietzsche says this world is the will to power and nothing besides, and you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. These moralities, which pretend to be objective, to be something other than a manifestation of the will to power, are sick, degenerate, and decadent. The problem of morality, Nietzsche accuses modern culture of being moralistic, expressing moral sentiments that conflict with one's behavior and equating those expressions with virtuous living. Being moralistic is a form of hypocrisy that Freudian psychologists refer to as action formation, an ego defense mechanism that attempts to prevent dangerous desires from being exposed by endorsing opposite types of behavior as barriers against them. In Nietzsche's view, modernity is anti-life and anti-nature in all moralistic sense. Modern Christianity moralities are all Christian, shows symptoms of this decadence, this decay. God is dead. Nietzsche thought that such moralistic symptoms signals the next level of evolution, the end of human history, and the beginning of the Übermensch. Some science and philosophy do not provide us with meaning. We create it, and like it or not, religion does not provide salvation. Nietzsche's famous said, God is dead. So Nietzsche and God, Nietzsche meant that the idea of God has lost its creative force, its full power. The full extent has not yet been felt by the masses, who still believe that they believe in God. Yet if we dig deep into our own psyche, we will discover that our one true faith is in scientific and technological progress. Moreover, Nietzsche thought that there is no turning back. God is dead and we have killed him. We still use the language of God in worship, but falsely. And even though some of us may sense that the old religions are dying, we are unable to face the consequences of life without God. So nihilism, according to Nietzsche, the death of God leads to nihilism, from the Latin word meaning nothing. Nihilism refers to the belief that the universe lacks objective meaning and purpose. Without God, there can be no objective base for value. In nihilistic universe, what determines what counts? According to Nietzsche, the answers are found in the subjective interest of individuals and groups. We choose systems and philosophies based on our senses of power, on which interpretation gives you and yours advantage over others. In slave morality, to control their superiors, members of the herd create slave morality, a value system based on guilt, fear, and distortion of the will to power, in which the characteristics of the inferior type are praised as virtues, while those of the superior type are condemned as arrogance. The morality is a common among merely human types who cannot face being alone in a godless world, whom Nietzsche calls the Untermensch. The Untermensch turns to the group for power and, aware of its inferiority, resents all higher types and elitist value systems. The resentment is a sign of slave morality, trying to convince the powerful that they should protect the weak. And the master morality, the Übermensch, and the Untermensch possess the will to power, but different approach. The Übermensch expresses power openly and honestly in a process of life-affirming self-creation. The Übermensch creates a new code of values and master morality, which looks only to that person for value, unlike slave morality, which is an aesthetic code of honor, where value is defined in aesthetic terms such as noble, honorable, refined, and so on, express what is good, and their opposites, shameful, vulgar, dishonorable, express what is evil. Having overcome mere human resentment and self-loathing, the Übermensch, living this master morality, enjoys being what and who he or she is. So, amor fati, in the absence of God, Nietzsche says we must redeem ourselves with the sacred yes to life expressed to amor fati, the love of fate, the love of our specific fate. That is, we should delight that everything is exactly as in what it is. Though amor fati, we realize that we exist as part of a complex whole that can only be precisely what it is and not otherwise. Nietzsche wrote, my formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be other than it is, not in the future, not in the past, not eternally, not merely to endure that which happens of necessity, but to love it. Okay, so that was a nice study of Nietzscheism. And so I got one more slide here. Actually, I'm going to do three more. So this is just a nice quick one on 5 people who challenged the worldview, going back to like Kuhn and the frame shifts and the paradigm shifts. So 5 people challenged the confronting view that left Europe fearing that there was no noble grand plan for the universe, that conflict rather than harmony was nature's normal condition, and that people themselves were not truly rational creatures. Although Europeans initially rejected these views, the shattering impact of World War I forced them to consider the possibility that these new views were correct. To Darwin and Marx, the works of Darwin and Marx provide the groundwork for the idea that conflict rather than harmony was the natural state of affairs in nature and society. Each developed a theory that held that biological and historical changes were the product of conflict. So Darwin, this conflict was captured in the term survival of the fittest. Darwin believed that struggle was not directed towards the achievement of any final outcome, such as a perfect human species, or even the continuation of humans at all. Darwin's theory about evolution essentially overturned the traditional theological framework for understanding the natural world. Marx believed that the goal of history was the attainment of harmonious classless society to which each person contributed according to their ability and each received all that they needed. Marx talked about a class struggle, or more formally, dialectic materialism. Marx called the religion the opiate of the people, while Darwin challenged the notion of orderly creation of the world in 6 literal days. But both writers, essentially contemporaries, challenged European religious belief at the time. While many might try to dismiss their ideas, both contended that they had reached their conclusions through scientific methods. Collectively, these two conflict. Theorists undermined elements of European religion, faith in science, and belief in harmony. Sigmund Freud. Freud expressed the notion that humans were rationalizers rather than rational, and therefore did not base their actions on careful, measured analysis of pleasure and pain. The late 19th and especially the early 20th century world saw Freud as a leading practitioner of the science of mind and regarded his findings as disturbing because they seemed to be scientifically valid. They had no way of knowing that Freud's ideas would be challenged, modified, and by many discredited in half a century or so. Freud's division of the mind into 3 components, id, ego, and superego, were historically significant because this approach directly contradicted the image of the mind as a rational, analytic calculator. Instead, Freud's view, decisions were the result of an interplay and conflict among the different components of the mind, where the idea of the long-term best interest of the person could be subordinated to a variety of short-term or instinctual goals. In this view, people did not plan rationally, but rather employed the appearance of rational planning for decisions that were truly the outcome of conflicts within mind. So it's an example from Freud. So the idea that people are rationalizers rather than rational undermined the image of Europeans as calculating people who looked to the long term and built a superior society characterized by progress. Furthermore, it suggested that there might be limits to the power of education to elevate lives, and it narrowed the distance between the civilized and the savage minds that justified late 19th century imperialism. Nietzsche offered the idea that God is dead, or that will to power rather than the rational analysis held the key to understanding historical change. Although he was institutionalized in 1889, his ideas were nurtured in the coming years through the efforts of his sister and came to be one of the key elements of existential philosophy and in some ways a support for the ideas of the Nazi movement. The late 19th century was very pleased with its material progress as measured by consumer opportunities and its governmental reforms that gave a voice to more and more members of society. Against the backdrop, the ideas of Nietzsche, when believed, deflated the pretensions of people who were seeking to define themselves as the most advanced members of humanity. Nietzsche's idea about God is dead meant that people did not have to weigh their thoughts and plans against the divine standards. In the case of Christians, against a judgment day, he argued that people had invented the idea of God in order to make themselves seem more important in the cosmos and not as insignificant, boring, self-indulgent, and self-satisfied as he believed they actually were. In fact, for Nietzsche, Christian morality shielded believers from having to make big decisions or confront their timid nature. Instead, they could assert that I could undertake such and such an action, but I wouldn't because God doesn't want me to. In this way, Nietzsche, people use religion to glorify their timid and unimportant existences. The assertion that God is dead was a liberating notion for Nietzsche and the existentialists. With that idea in mind, people were free to undertake any action they wished because they had only this one moment of existence and could spend it any way they chose. After all, in Nietzsche's final analysis, there was no better or worse choices from the standpoint of morality the notion was horrifying to many when it was pronounced. The Superman, Nietzsche also famous for the idea of the Übermensch. If most people are timid and unimportant, how does historical change take place? The answer is the world periodically produces an Übermensch, Superman, who restructures the world, not to improve it, but because he can do and he wants to. The new world is no better or superior to the prior one, just different. The Superman, in an act of will, rearranges the world and its beliefs or its organizations just because it pleases him aesthetically, in the same way that a poet might choose one phrase over the other for a poet. So Nietzsche therefore scorned the majority of his fellow late 19th century humans as mediocre and deluded by the religion they had created. In turn, he valued Superman as the only person worthy of admiration because he rearranges the world to please himself. Napoleon might be an example, and Hitler would consider himself to be a Superman and therefore above the laws and opinions of his fellow Germans. And Einstein produced his theory of relativity that held that observers such as scientists could not make any statements about the world that were absolutely true because all such statements depend on where the observer was standing. If you changed your observation point, what you saw in your measurements of it changed as well. For this reason, the world was never fully knowable in the sense that no two people might see the world in exactly the same way because they observed it from different positions, and each was right from his or her own perspective. The argument undercut the idea drawn from Newton and the laws of nature that nature could be described by a set of laws that were everywhere true. So certitude about the world was fading. The sense of security in living in a world which could ultimately be fully known, described, and understood was gone. Some people felt cast adrift in the same way that earlier Europeans felt lost when the idea of a sun-centered universe superseded the idea of a universe where everything revolved around the earth and humanity in its center. Collectively, these new ideas, upset most of the underlying ideas derived from the world of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. It would take some years, even a century, for all of these new ideas to percolate through European and American culture, but the result was the creation of a world of modern ideas sharply different from those cherished by mainstream thinkers in the late 19th century. Okay, awesome. We got 7 people here. Okay. So I'm gonna do two more here. And I might come back later, give my voice a rest, and come back a little bit later. Look at the chat. Okay, I appreciate people tuning in, being active in the chat. I'll read through this later when I add the timestamp in the table of content. Yeah, so I'm glad to have added Nietzsche in like the foundations, talking about consciousness and kind of these ideas of how consciousness and the brain works. All these factors have to be factored in to this. So there's a quick one on the philosophy of education related to all this. So maybe to drive in these ideas by saying a practical application of these ideas. So philosophy of education, all teachers have personal philosophy that colors the way they teach. Engaging in philosophy helps clarify what they do or intend to do, justify or explain why they do what they do in a logical, systematic manner. So understanding two important notions: who they are or intend to be, why they do or purpose to do what they do. So Aaron Burns, 3 important questions: who am I? Why am I here? Who are all these other people? And what do they want from me? So the meaning of philosophical inquiry: whatever people choose to embrace, if their choices are made in a logical, rational manner, they are engaged in a process of doing philosophy. 3 specific areas of philosophical inquiry: metaphysics, concerned with questions about the nature of reality; epistemology, concerned with the nature of knowledge; axiology, concerned with the nature of values. Idealism, so particular philosophies of education. Idealism, the first systematic philosophy in Western thought: Socrates and Plato. Socratic method, dialogue. Generic notion: philosophers often pose abstract questions. They're not easily answered, but are concerned with the search for truth. World of matter in constant state of flux. Senses are not to be trusted, continue to deceive us. Truth is perfect and eternal, but not found in the world of matter, only through mind. Idealism. The only constant for Plato was mathematics, unchangeable and eternal. Plato's method of dialogue engaged in systematic logical examination of all points of view, ultimately leading to agreement and synthesis of ideas. This approach was known as dialectic. Plato believed that education helped move individuals collectively towards achieving the good. The state should be involved in education, moving brighter students towards abstract ideas, and the less able toward collecting data, a gender-free tracking system. Those who are brighter should rule, others should assume rules to maintain the state. Philosopher King would lead the state to the ultimate good. Evil comes through ignorance. Education will lead to the obliteration of evil. More modern idealists, you have St. Augustine, Descartes, Kant, and Hegel. Goal of education, interest in the search for truth through ideas. With truth comes responsibility to enlighten others. Education is transformational. Ideas can change lives. The role of teacher to analyze and discuss ideas with students so that the students can move to new levels of awareness so that they can ultimately be transformed. Abstractions dealt with through the dialectic, but should aim to connect analysis with action. The role of the teacher is to bring out what is already in the student's mind, reminiscence. So methods of instruction. The ideal is a lecture from time to time, but primary method of teaching is the dialectic, discuss, analyze, synthesize, and apply what they've read to contemporary society. In curriculum, importance of the study of the classics. Many support a back to the basics approach to education. Realism. Aristotle is the leading proponent of realism. Started in the Lyceum, the first philosopher to develop a systematic theory of logic. General notions, only through studying the material world is it possible to clarify or develop ideas. Matter is real independent of ideas. So Aristotle's systematic theory of logic, began with empirical research, speculate or use dialectic reasoning, accumulate in syllogism. Syllogisms consist of logic that consists of three parts, a major premise, a minor premise, and conclusion. For the syllogism to work, all parts must be correct. So the philosopher is concerned, what's the good life? What's the importance of reason? Moderation in all things, balance in leading one's life. Reasoning is the instrument to help individuals achieve balance and moderation. Realist, Neotomism, from Aquinas, affected a synthesis of pagan ideas and Christian beliefs. Reason is the means of discerning and understanding truth. God could be understood through reason based on the material world, no conflict between science and religion, the world of faith with the world of reason, contemporary Catholic schools. Modern realism, from the Renaissance, Francis Bacon developed induction, the scientific method, based on Aristotle, developed a method starting with observation, culminating in generalization, tested in specific instance for the purpose of verification. John Locke, tabula rasa, things known from experience, ordered sense data and the reflected on them. Contemporary realists tend to focus on philosophy and science. Albert North Whitehead, concerned with the search for universal patterns. Bertrand Russell, with Whitehead, principle mathematical, universal patterns could be verified and classified through mathematics. Goal of education for realists. Notion of the good life, truth, beauty could be answered through the study of ideas using the dialectic method. For contemporary realists, the goal of education is to help individuals understand and apply the principles of science to help solve problems plaguing the modern world. Teachers should be steeped in the basic academic disciplines. Pragmatism, American philosophy from the 19th century, Pierce, James Dewey. Sorry about that. By their fruits you shall know them. Pragmatism encourages people to find processes that work in order to achieve their desired ends. Action-oriented, experimentally grounded. Rousseau, back to nature, environment and experience. Amelia, little regard for the education of woman other than Amelia's companion. John Dewey, intellectual heir to Darwin. Constant interaction between organism and environment. Dynamic and developing world. Child-centered progressiveness and social reconstructionism. Instrumentalism, experimentalism. Pragmatic relationship between school and society in applying ideas of education on an experimental basis. Dewey's philosophy, education starts with the needs and interests of the child, allows the child to participate in planning her course of study. Employ project methods of group learning depend heavily on experimental learning. Children are active organic beings needing both freedom and responsibility. Ideas are not separate from social conditions. Philosophy has a responsibility to society. Dewey's role of the teacher, not the authoritarian, but the facilitator, encourages, offers suggestions, questions, and helps plans and implement courses of study. Has command of several disciplines, inquiry method, problem solving, integrated curriculum. So existentialism and phenomenology, Kierkegaard, Buber, Jasper, Sartre, Maxine Green, existentialists, Purcell, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, phenomenologists. How do one's concerns affect the life of an individual, the phenomenon of consciousness, perception, meaning, and an individual's experience? Based on the earth alone, must make sense of the chaos and encounters. Existence precedes the essence. People must create themselves and create their own meaning, done through the choices people make in their lives. In a state of constant becoming, an individual can make a difference in seemingly absurd world. Is existentialist. Education focused on the needs of individuals, including the non-rational as well as rational, the notion of possibility. Teachers should understand their own lived world. It helps students to understand their world, the need to be wide awake. The role of the teacher is intensely personal. So neo-Marxism, radical critique on capitalism. The role of education should be to give students the insight to demystify capitalism and become agents of radical change. Marx believed the history of civilization was defined by class struggle, general conflict theory. The teacher is a transformative intellectual. Okay, so good to have these like large, overviews going back to Aristotle, and to see how these new ideas fall into place in an issue like education. As I mean, many people have said that in essence, everything is a commentary on the Plato and Aristotle. And so I want to conclude with one last PowerPoint, semi-unrelated, to move into other things later, but I just saw this today. I think we're going to include it. And just thinking out loud, I might also try to include Heidegger and Derrida for the study of consciousness and the nature of meaning, built off of Sartre. I've done a lot of linguistics. But I think we can conclude with this on America's godly heritage. So looking back, mission of our forefathers, 1620, the Mayflower Compact for the advancement of Christian faith in the name of King James, the defender of the faith. I'll read the Mayflower Compact. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God, and by one another covenant and combine ourselves together in a civic body politic for a better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and in Scotland, the 54th. The year of our Lord, 1620. So you say Thanksgiving. First school, 1647, the Old Deluder, Satan Law. Taught the Bible. Declaration of Independence, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights on neighbor rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Jay, President of Continental Congress. Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is a duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. George Washington, first inaugural address, 1789. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. In the Massachusetts Constitution, 1780, any person choosing governor, lieutenant governor, counselor, senator, or representative and accepting the trust shall, before he proceeds to execute the duties of his place or office, make and subscribe the following declarations. Do declare to believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth. The Articles of Confederation, 1781. The Articles of Confederation, document drafted in 1777, ratified in 81. All agreed in cooperation between the United States and sent delegates of the United States of America to participate. Indeed, following the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, these articles spoke of the great governor of the world who authorized us to ratify the said Articles of Confederation and perpetual union. So religion in schools, the Northwest Ordinance, 1787 and 89, declared religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good govern and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. Thus, religion was deemed by our founding fathers to be necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. And McGuffey's Eclectic Reader. John, you must always bear in mind that it is God who made you and who gave you all that you have and all that you hope for. He sent his son to show you his will and to die for your sake. He gave you his word to let you know what he had done for you and what he bids you to do. Presidential Prayer Proclamation, George Washington, 1789, declared, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God and to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits and humbly to implore his protection and favor, I recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. To school-sponsored Bible reading, 1844. Pictures. You get the Declaration and Condition of State. All the original states endorsed the Declaration, and every state since has been required to form a government that is in conformity with the U.S. Constitution and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The last one, Hawaii, 1959. So where did this change? How did this godly heritage of the United States change? In Darwin, interesting. This slideshow doesn't mention, but could be interesting. The place of making exceptions for Jews to these oaths that very early in the early 1800s, most places started making exceptions for Jews to serve in government. So, no evidence for a creator, belief in Darwin, belief in God, religion. There's no evidence that man was aboriginally endowed with the ennobling belief in the existence of an omnipotent God. The idea of a universal and beneficent creator does not seem to arise in the mind of man until he has been elevated by long-continued culture. Nowadays, in our evolutionary conception of the universe, there's absolutely no room for a creator. There's Karl Marx, then Hitler, Mein Kampf, 1924, nature does not wish that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such a case, all our efforts to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. The 1925 Scopes trial, evolution text taught racism. John Scopes taught Caucasians have evolved as the highest type of all races. Secular humanism, 1933 manifesto. No creator, no creation, no God-given moral absolutes. The exact opposite of the Declaration of Independence. So no creator. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. No creation. Humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. And no God-given moral absolutes. Modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantee of human values. We affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. So 1934, John Dewey, Common Faith. Here are all the arguments for a religious faith of humanism. Such faith has always been implicitly the common faith of mankind. It remains to make it explicit and militant. It's a humanistic goal. Preach this new faith of humanism in the public schools. So the atheist John Dunphy, convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged in one of the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as the proselytizers of the new faith, the religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or large state universities. So more history. 1961, atheist religions protected. 1962, class prayer banned from schools. Next year, class devotional Bible readings banned. 1973, law protecting the unborn nullified. 1980, 10 Commandments banned in schools. 87, teaching creation banned from schools. between 1960 and 1990, teenage pregnancy up 200%, divorce up 200%, teen suicide up 300%, violent crime up 500%, abortion up 1,000%, child abuse rose to an all-time high. Nietzsche, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How should we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? So another atheist, Bazarth. Finally, it is irresistible. We must ask how we can kill the God of Christianity. We need only ensure that our schools teach only secular knowledge. If we could achieve this, God would indeed be shortly due for a funeral service. Dostoevsky, if God is dead, anything is permissible. So we've been saying 19th century, God died, man killed God. In the next century, man killed each other. Meanwhile, back in America, we said it couldn't happen here. Okay, so last note, 1987, no religious test for office. The U.S. Constitution reads, no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. No religious test means a particular religion, not belief in God, common to all religions in view at the time. 5 states had their own state religions at the time. Northwest Ordinance encouraged religion in general. First Amendment encouraged religion in general by the Free Exercise Clause, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Many states required belief in God as a condition for public office. Otherwise, the Declaration of Independence would be unconstitutional since it declares the belief in God as basis for our government. Belief in the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence is still a condition for statehood. Each state recognizes God in its state constitution preamble. Okay, so I saw that when I was flipping through. I found that pretty interesting. I'm gonna put the link in the chat. See if anyone probably gonna call it quits for today. I appreciate people coming on. If people are new to what I'm talking about and they want to just pop on and join, or if someone wants to ask something in the chat, and like I wasn't necessarily reading it while I was talking earlier, so I'll make a point to answer the chat. And I might even do more streaming later tonight because I want to get done with this maybe this week. So maybe I'll do my Eastern religions, view in nativism, world history, and then tomorrow I'll try to do my finishing up with linguistics, and I'll try to search some nice things on Heidegger and Derrida and deconstructionism related to linguistics. And then I got my long view overview of Christianity through the ages, and that will conclude my overview of consciousness. And this was largely just a public research session where kind of like I'm a chess player, so if you see like they have these chess videos where people play chess and then they speak into saying what they're thinking about while they're doing it. So this was similar in that respect, where it's basically a live study session where I was just kind of, most of it I was actually just purely repeating it because it's kind of like memory, if anyone saw my video on speed reading and memory. So this was somewhat an experiment that we've been talking about. Verbo Tapastis, like to talk with you. We argued that time about multiculturalism. The link's in the chat if you want to talk a few minutes. Instead of we come onto your show, maybe we'll have an exact topic, and just I'd like to know what I'm talking about, so you could see. I did like 100 hours of research into consciousness, covering all different aspects from philosophy, theology, science. And I focus a lot on science. And I'm going to finish up tomorrow, to really come down to what the top thinkers of the day, scientists, know. And I really, I've been studying this my whole life, so I wanted to organize it and see how unorganized it is, because I have like 15 videos, and they're all multiple hours. So just like all this information, a lot of these subjects are like full college courses I took, or some of these subjects I have whole like shelves of books on. So but from debating and talking, it's just that thinking about memory, that these things should be on the tip of my tongue, and really refresh these ideas. And it was somewhat catalyzed by the lecture that I did on speed reading and memory, thinking about speed reading and benefiting intellectual processes, in my belief that in essence, like I did the 5 famous thinkers that changed thought. I would like, God willing, to do the same thing. I think I have a lot of ideas, but I wanted to base myself in the tradition. So I wanted to have a good overview before I start proposing my own concepts on consciousness. I want to, that's grounded in science and empiricism, and that I've looked over what the wise men of the previous generations have said about it. And hopefully, maybe over the next few years, might not happen this year, because if I move into the Freemasonry and try to do something on the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, all 33 degrees, that's going to take quite a bit of time, like a few months, one show for each degree. And but at some point I'd like to start putting out some of my own unique ideas on consciousness. So I want to get this good overview and just do this public study session for people who follow me or see me on shows or talk or debate. And people have seen I've been adding timestamps and table of contents to my videos for my own research and my own basis, but for other people also, that kind of just like a free learning source out there. Like when I first started doing esoteric Doooovidism, I started with Duties of the Heart, the Hebrew wisdom from North Africa 1,000 years ago, written in Arabic. And I did it as a thank to the author of that book and to my creator that I came onto this wisdom. And I'd also like to thank, Isaac Newton, thanking the wise people who came before him, and saying, we just standing on the shoulders of giants, so to say, and pay homage to the people whose thought has profoundly affected me. And so I mean, I could give a traditional backdrop on Judaism. There's a lot of resources on Judaism out there, and I might come back on later tonight and do these slides I have on Hinduism and world, history of the world and thought, just so I could finish up with this week, and then move on to different things. And then maybe once I'm done with this, because I don't like to talk about what I don't know about. Like generally, I usually don't monologue. I usually, I have no enjoyment in just hearing myself sound stupid. So I wanted to really know what I'm talking about in review. Do a little medical marijuana, thinking about that in terms of the study in consciousness. And but a lifetime of study. Thank God, most of my life I've been a scholar, so to say, a researcher. I've spent probably 10 plus years in advanced education institutes, rabbinic schools, universities. I consider myself Hasidic, although I'm not really pigeonholed, because I'm kind of like a Freemason, a Universalist. So it's hard to classify myself in a form of Judaism. And maybe I'll go back to doing some like Ask the Rabbis. I wanted to do an Ask the Rabbi on half Jews and conversion, and maybe the new law in Israel. I want to complete this consciousness thing, and it was really a bigger labor than I expected when I first started doing it. As you could see, I'm going to put out like 50 hours of video on the subject, and really I only touched the surface. And I ordered like 30 books in the time I've been doing it and reading books. I'm looking at all these different histories of mathematics and science and trying to correspond them all, because really consciousness is kind of like the apex of all of these studies. It requires the mastery of all of these different complex ideas and studies to understand consciousness. And you see, like when I read tomorrow, hopefully, this final study that I'm going to be reading on the overview of scientific evidence for consciousness arising from the brain, that it really does require like PhD level science in multiple fields: electrical engineering, biology, physics, philosophy. You have to really know these things. And coming back and like looking at like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and even Freud and all these like understandings of, is the brain a predictive machine? How do you understand the brain and all the things that the brain do? And to some extent, you really have to know the grounding. My father, when I was young, over our TV, my father had like 100-book series of the Western classics, And I remember browsing through these books as a kid, Locke and Descartes and Plato and Kant and Hume, and I really love that stuff. Like, and then my father is a doctor. He has hundreds of books on the subject of like these trying consciousness and modern biology and trying to like the grand unified theory and the discovery for truth. Although my father likes fantasy and science fiction and television generally, I don't subscribe to any form of entertainment. I'm more straight serious. But my father also is a pretty big scholar on these subjects. So I grew up with a large library and seen all these books. And I always had interest buying the most recent books. And thank God my father's successful. So he almost always has like the latest books and getting them as they come out. And so I have a pretty big library, but like my father has a much bigger library than I do. And so just a lifetime, really, like 20 years, 40 years old, a lifetime of research into the subject. At some point, 20 years is not a little bit of time, but relatively, I'm still young in that respect. And but I feel like my research to some extent is hitting a point where I'm getting a profound feeling of different subjects, putting them together, and might have some of my own unique ideas. And to know your own, if your ideas are unique, you really have to be an expert in history and have read the great minds of the past to know whether your ideas are truly unique or not. Saying in like big scholars like force you to be free or something like Richard Spencer or something. He's being popular saying these ideas will force you to be free, and saying that that comes from the past. That was the existentialist who had said that, in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and to some extent that had been discussed by the ancient Greeks. Almost everything as a precursor, and I haven't even discussed much Judaism. Most of this consciousness stuff has been truly the Western tradition, and that's what I'm going to add to it. There's a lot of stuff on Kabbalah, and I've read thousands of books on Judaism. Judaism is the subject I put the most study into of anything, and actually the Kabbalah is something I've intensely studied. I've read hundreds of books. I studied under one of the most famous Kabbalah teachers of the past generation, Rav Daniel Frisch of blessed memory in Jerusalem, who wrote a commentary on the Zohar. I was in Brooklyn. Like I knew almost all the major Kabbalists who spoke on the subject. And Chabad, I'm very familiar with Chabad Lubavitch. I put a lot of thought into it. And to some extent, I think the Kabbalistic system is extremely powerful. But because a large part of my audience is not Jewish, I'll probably go with Freemasonry. And Albert Pike is an interesting character because he sources a lot of Kabbalah. And I might, the Scottish Rite was largely developed by renegade Jews, that the 33-degree system of the Scottish Rite, it has a lot of Jewish and Kabbalistic influence. So I might use the system of the Scottish Rite, Freemasonry, to try to organize these thoughts. And although I could describe it from a purely Judeo perspective, but that requires, the sole belief that the Torah and, I always quote Newton, one of my favorite minds, the being able to hold multiple conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. And if I were going to speak about Judaism, I might even be speaking in Yiddish or a different language. And I might do some more Ask the Rabbis also on topic by topic, see where it comes, if I'm trying to build a community of intellect. So I would put out there my current stand of research and, just some content on my channel to show I'm a serious intellectual. I dedicated 2 weeks of time, like 100 hours, just to, showing my level of research on the subject and my thoughts on the subject. And I'm hoping to build some sort of community. And I said, everything I've done up to now, I've not included any of my own unique thoughts. All I've been doing is my recapitulation and understanding and amalgamation of the greatest minds of the different traditions. And although I think I have my own unique thoughts, and I'd like to organize those. And as I said, part of that, this was organizing. And you've seen these studies, like the scientific studies that I've read through at length, and the ones I chose to read through. Most of the good studies are ones that give a thorough history of the ideas and the current modern studies of the ideas on what's already been answered, what other people are thinking about, what they're coming to answer. So in the way that see the studies that I've spent hours reading through word for word, they've been overviews in different areas of consciousness that brought the evidence from the other great thinkers, historically and modernly, the experiments that they're doing and showing where their thoughts fit in. So to that extent, that's largely what I'm doing. So I thought I'd just publicly do this research where, one thing is the own aid to my own intellect and memory, that, saying the words out loud, listening to my own voice might have a better impact on my memory and understanding these concepts than just reading it or speed reading. And hopefully I'd like to create community to actually discuss these topics, because most of my adult life, I haven't really discussed these ideas with people. I've just studied. I was always a good student, universities, serving rabbis, serving Hinduism, serving gurus, and in yeshiva, and almost always I was a well-behaved, good student, very serious, took my studies seriously. But largely I'm just a private intellectual, and I don't have anyone to discuss these things with. So I'm just talking to myself, putting it out there. In my debate for JF, which was interesting, but maybe it's kind of disappointing. Like, I don't know if I created a community of people interested in this stuff, but hopefully through these videos, maybe I'll be able to create community. And there's somewhat like an intellectual. I'm not a PhD. I only did a year of master's work in civil engineering. So a lot of the intellectuals that PhDs or published authors probably wouldn't even talk to me, or there'd be money, the cult or something. So I just want to know the truth, really. Like, I really just like understanding how things work. I want to understand. I don't even necessarily have a purpose in mind. Like, reading through Nietzsche and the will to power, and I do see some perspective that everybody has their own will to power in some sort of universal brotherhood of man, where everybody could be a real man, whatever that definition of a man is within the universal brotherhood. And I'm working to try to flush out these ideas and amalgamate things together. And the academic system, I think, is largely somewhat useless. I'm saying, like, there's a lot of good study in intellect. JF said he'd have me on his show again. I'm not sure what we talk about, so I don't know a good topic, and I don't know if there's any benefit to me going on a show, at least in the near future, anytime soon. If there was a debate or something, I might debate Rodney Martin on Judaism, Christianity next week. I'm not sure how interesting that will be. Hopefully that'll be good. I like Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish, yeah, it's just a pigeon of German. And but to some extent, because I'm not a native Yiddish speaker, so like I think in Jewish, so to say, like Yiddish just means Jewish. So that if I was talking to my fellow Jews, I would speak in Yiddish, and it'd just be simple, because obviously hardly anyone knows Yiddish. And even if someone speaks German, or like only someone who's really like internal in Jewish circles is going to be able to speak in Yiddish. So when I'm not worried about like code shifting, we talk about in linguistics where you code shift, where you have two different language. So if I was talking to an internal audience of all Jews, even though really only Ashkenazic Jews speak, I might prefer Yiddish, because that's just like the mindset of a Jew, assuming Judaism is true, assuming we're God's chosen people, assuming that we have a different type soul and type, as opposed to the more objective form of Freemasonry that I would use. So Yiddish might be more natural. And I don't know if I have such a role. Like, I'll do an occasional Ask the Rabbi, but like, if there's such a role to teach Judaism, there's so many resources out there for teaching Judaism. And like, I don't really want to spend too much time on it. I like history and going through. If I found some good charts, I might go through a subject here and there for Ask the Rabbi, but I don't really see myself as having a role in teaching Judaism. If I was teaching Judaism to Jews or to converts to Judaism, or people, I mean, if you're in Detroit, you could find me in synagogue, and like I would learn Torah with you. I would teach you Torah. Yeah, I would probably even answer like simple, dumb questions, like simple translations of Hebrew. Or if I built myself up, God willing, found the right woman and built up a family, yeah, I might have disciples, students, and I would teach Torah to, and that would be, like rabbi as a Jew to fellow Jew who wants to be part of the tradition, as opposed to like intellectual discussion of Judaism to like interfaith. And like people who've been following my channel from before I started these live streams, I've been doing interfaith for many years, I'm practically, in my state area, Metro Detroit, I have interfaith with almost all the major religious figures from the area, and even nationally, like I'm involved with, some of the interfaith circuit. I'm very familiar with that concept, and that's why I like the language of Freemasonry, and to get the backdrop of philosophy versus the difference of when a Jew teaches his fellow Jew. Like when I was in yeshiva, it was a completely different. Like everyone was a believer relatively, and everybody followed the ritual, or at least tried to follow the ritual, and thought that God was behind. It wasn't an academic pursuit. The purpose was to serve God. The purpose was to come closer to God. And these were people who wanted to come closer to God within the Jewish way. And like I do, like, so Israeli, that's not, I mean, I could talk about Israeli politics or something, but I mean, Judaism is a completely different thing, and the scholars and Talmudic stuff. So, these are more possibilities. I might do a dinner break. I might come back on tonight and do some Hinduism. I've been researching Hinduism for like 5 years. I have like hundreds of books on it. You can see my Hare Krishna videos. I've actually, quite affiliated with the Hare Krishna movement. Like if you're in New York and like you see people chanting on the street Hare Krishna, they might even know me. A lot of them come through Detroit or through Facebook, and I know like the senior leaders of the movement, and I've read the theology, and I'm very interested in Hinduism. To some extent, Hinduism. I like Kabbalah, but internal Kabbalah has this caste type system and is based on the Judeo rituals. You could separate Kabbalah from the Judeo rituals, but it's really based upon the Judeo rituals and the prophecies of Moses, as where when you separate the system of Kabbalah to a separate esoteric system, it takes a different flavor, with like maybe Hermetics or modern magic or the different forms today where you see that, or even Freemasonry. In Hinduism might be similar also, but I think that for consciousness, the concepts of Hinduism are actually in best correspondence of any of the systems with modern physics and cosmology and consciousness. So I want to do some. Well, I mean, that's the concept of Freemasonry. So you could exist within your own paradigm. So obviously, within the paradigm of Judaism, you believe that Moses was a prophet and that God's prophecy to the Jewish people is real, and these actions are real. That when a Jew performs a certain action, it really makes some sort of difference in the larger world. And so I mean, like now, like I'm more debating Judaism. Like people have the JQ, and I have to use philosophy and defend my Judaism, as opposed to being within the frame of Judaism, where where it's just assumed, like in yeshiva and rabbinic school, it was just an assumption of truth that the Bible is true. The Jews are God's chosen people. The halakha and all the rituals are necessary to perform, and that this is the path to come closer to God and fulfill God's will. So that was just taken as a given. And within any paradigm, like in university, they might have granted me leniency to be different, but there was the paradigm within every system, and that's kind of the Freemasonry, where we could come and meet together. My ideas on multicultural conservatism, where we could meet together in the public square, but yet go home and have our own different frames for viewing reality, even though our different frames for reality have a different understanding for how the public square should be handled. So, I mean, these are pretty complicated concepts, and that's, what I'd like to get more into. So I appreciate everyone watching. I might be on later tonight just to try to finish up what I'm doing this week on the consciousness. So shalom, namaste, Hare Krishna, blessings. So I'm mainly doing this as a public study session, a service to my creator, a service to humanity, just putting out some intellectualism. And hopefully people will find this and we'll be able to create some sort of intellectual community to further these thoughts. And we might disagree on many different issues, but it doesn't mean that we can't push forward scholarship. And as I showed in my response to JF on multiculturalism, the value of diversity, that diversity, one of the benefits of diversity is increasing intellectualism and pushing forward scholarship, that having diverse people who think differently drive scholarship forward. So thanks everybody again. Shalom and